We are standing in the cool, silent earth of central Bulgaria, inside a narrow brick corridor built 24 centuries ago. The air is still, holding the scent of dust and pigment, a subterranean quiet that feels ancient and absolute. This is the antechamber of the tomb of Kazanlak, a passageway leading to a small, perfect beehive chamber, a tholos, sealed beneath a massive earthen mound known as a tumulus. Torchlight, or perhaps just the light of our imagination, flickers across the plastered walls, and the paintings preserved there come alive in the gloom. A man and a woman, a Thracian noble and his wife, sit facing one another at a funerary feast. He, dark-haired and noble, reaches for her wrist with a gesture of gentle possession, or perhaps a final lingering farewell. She, veiled and serene, offers him a piece of fruit. Around them, servants bring trays of pomegranates and figs, musicians play the lyre, and grooms tend to magnificent, high-spirited horses, part of a grand procession painted in the corridor outside. This is the golden mystery of the Thracian kings, a sudden, vivid, and achingly beautiful window into a world that left no books, no epics, no histories of its own. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where and when you're listening from tonight. Our story begins here, not with a written word or a royal decree, but with a painted scene of departure, a silent conversation from the 4th century BC. The Thracians are, without question, one of the most significant and enigmatic peoples of the ancient world, a vast, powerful, and culturally rich group who occupied the eastern Balkan peninsula, an area stretching across modern-day Bulgaria, parts of Romania, Greece, and Turkey. Yet for all their power, they remain a people of shadow and echo. They were the neighbors of the Greeks, the subjects of the Persians, the enemies of the Macedonians, and the eventual subjects of the Romans. And it is through these other, louder cultures that most of their story has been told. The Greeks, in particular, viewed them with a mixture of fascination and disdain, seeing them as the quintessential barbarians, wild, drunk, and dangerously emotional, yet also producers of sublime music, fearsome warriors, and masters of intricate goldwork that defied classification. The Thracians themselves were not silent, but their language is lost to us. They were an Indo-European people, but their tongue, lacking its own script, vanished into the thin air of history, surviving only in a few glosses, words recorded by Greek scholars, and in the names of their kings, gods, and mountains. This profound literacy gap means our journey is not one of newfound texts, but of archaeology, of digging into the very mounds that dot the Bulgarian landscape, like the one at Kazanlak. This tomb, discovered by accident in 1944 by soldiers digging a trench, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a masterpiece of Hellenistic art, but it is not purely Greek. The artist may have been trained in the classical tradition, but the subject, the feeling, the soul of the artwork is distinctly Thracian. The intimacy of the couple, the reverence for the horses, the specific rituals of the feast, these elements speak to a unique belief system, a different way of seeing the passage from this life to the next. This tomb is just one of thousands that populate the so-called Valley of the Thracian rulers, a landscape that is less a valley and more a vast open-air necropolis. Each tumulus, each earthen hill covers a story, Many hold treasures of astonishing gold and silver, while others have been plundered by time and robbers. The Kazanlak tomb itself was likely robbed in antiquity, its gold and silver vessels taken, leaving only the imperishable, the paintings on the wall that tell a more personal story than gold ever could. The man and woman depicted are anonymous, though he was clearly a chieftain or kinglet of immense local importance. The paintings, frozen in time, pose the central questions of our entire journey. Who were these people who blended Greek refinement with what their contemporaries called barbaric passion? What did they believe about the afterlife that compelled them to bury their leaders in such elaborate art-filled chambers, often accompanied by their sacrificed horses, wives, and armor? We are tasked with piecing together a mosaic of a civilization from fragments, shards of pottery, the whispers of Greek historians like Herodotus, the intricate patterns on a golden rhyton, and the sorrowful gaze of a painted queen. The Thracians were not a single, unified nation, but a constellation of tribes. Over 40 were named by Greek sources, who shared a common language and culture, but spent much of their time fighting each other. They were the Odrysians, the Getae, the Bessi, the Tribali, names that sound like thunder rolling through the Haemus and Rhodope mountains. They were a people who, according to Herodotus, would be the most powerful of all nations were they only united. That disunity was their defining political feature, but it also created a fierce, localized cultural intensity, evident in the unique styles of their armor, their pottery, and their tombs. The Kazanlak frescoes, therefore, are our starting point, our anchor. They show us a people who valued feasting, music, and the horse above all else. They show us a sophisticated aristocracy that, while importing Greek vases and hiring Greek artists, was not merely copying its southern neighbors. They were patrons, selecting and adapting foreign styles to fit their own spiritual and political needs. The tomb is a statement of power, but also of a deeply personal belief in a journey beyond death, one where the feast would continue and the bonds of this life, symbolized by that gentle clasp of the wrist, would endure. We are looking at a culture that embraced the ecstatic, the mystical, and the warlike all at once. They are the people who gave the world the myth of Orpheus, the poet who could charm nature itself, and Spartacus, the gladiator who nearly brought Rome to its knees. They are a paradox, a people of the oral tradition remembered in writing, a people of the forest and mountain immortalized in gold. As we leave this painted chamber and begin our journey back in time, we carry this image of the feasting couple, a quiet promise that even in the absence of written words, history leaves behind powerful, beautiful, and deeply human ghosts. To find the true beginnings of the people who built such magnificent tombs, we must pull back from that painted chamber, leaving the 4th century behind and letting the centuries dissolve like mist. We are journeying deep into the unwritten past, into a time before the Thracians even had a name, searching for the first echoes of their language and their gods. Our search takes us to the vast, windswept grasslands north of the Black Sea, the Pontic Caspian steppe, during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. It was from this sprawling cradle of cultures, archaeologists and linguists theorize, that a great expansion began. These were the Proto-Indo-Europeans, a semi-nomadic people who had mastered the horse, harnessed it to wheeled carts, and worshipped a pantheon of sky gods. Sometime in the 4th and 3rd millennia BC, driven by forces we can only guess at, climatic change, population pressure, or the simple restless urge of a pastoral people, they began to move. Waves of these migrants, carrying their language and their genes, pushed west into the heart of Europe. One branch of this great human river flowed south into the Balkan Peninsula, a land of rugged mountains, dense forests, and fertile river valleys that was already home to sophisticated, settled agricultural societies. This was the land of Old Europe, a world of tells and goddess figurines, exemplified by the astonishingly ancient Varna culture on the Bulgarian coast, which had already produced the world's oldest processed gold treasure millennia before the Thracians existed as a distinct group. The arrival of the steppe peoples was not a single, clean invasion, but a long, slow, and complex process of mingling, conflict, and synthesis. The newcomers brought their herds, their horses, their warrior ethos, and their patriarchal gods of thunder and sun. The established peoples contributed their deep knowledge of the land, their farming traditions, and perhaps their own chthonic, earth-based deities. From this long, slow fusion of blood, language, and belief, a new cultural identity began to crystallize, and we can begin to call these people the Proto-Thracians. This was the dawn of the Bronze Age, a period defined by the transformative power of metal. The lands the Thracians settled, the Haemus Mountains, the Rhodope Ranges, the plains of the Maritsa River, were rich in copper and tin, the essential ingredients for this new alloy. The introduction of bronze did not just create better tools, it created better weapons, and with them, a new, more stratified and warlike social structure. The archaeological record from this long, formative era is not written in ink, but in earth and bronze. We find the evidence in the emergence of fortified hilltop settlements, high places of refuge that speak of a land where safety was not guaranteed, where tribal rivalries were likely endemic. We see the very first tumuli, the ancestors of the Great Mound at Kazanlak. These early Bronze Age burial mounds are simpler, lacking the elaborate stonework and frescoes, but the core idea is already present. A monumental marker for a revered leader, a practice brought from the steppes and given new life in Balkan soil. Inside these graves, and in scattered hoards buried for safekeeping, we find the artifacts of this emerging culture. We unearth socketed spearheads, long bronze daggers, and distinctive heavy axes designed for a warrior elite. We also find the tentative beginnings of the Thracian love for adornment. Simple bronze torques, spiral armbands, and pins, the first glimmers of the aesthetic that would one day burst forth in showers of intricate gold. Their pottery, too, tells a story, blending the incised geometric patterns of the steppe cultures with the curvilinear, flowing motifs of Old Europe. This was a culture in formation, defined by its geography, the mountains' isolated tribes, allowing dozens of distinct identities to flourish, while the rivers like the Danube and the Maritsa served as highways for trade, contact, and conflict. The Thracians became a people of the hill and forests, masters of horses, which they revered not just as tools of war, but as sacred animals, companions on the journey to the afterlife, a belief that would endure for 2,000 years. Their religion in this deep past was a tapestry woven from two threads, the inherited Indo-European sky gods, who would later be recognized by the Greeks as forms of Zeus and Apollo, and the powerful local spirits of the land. They felt the divine presence in the rocky crags, the dark caves, and the rushing springs of the mountains. This was a chthonic faith, tied to the earth, the rocks, and the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. This dual faith, a reverence for the heavens and a deep connection to the earth, would become a hallmark of Thracian spirituality, giving rise to their ecstatic cults and their profound beliefs in an afterlife. This was the world that hardened them, that forged their reputation for ferocity and resilience. As the Bronze Age reached its tumultuous climax around 1200 BC, the entire eastern Mediterranean world was convulsed by the mysterious Bronze Age collapse. Empires like the Hittites vanished, Mycenaean Greece fell into a dark age, and Egypt was beset by the Sea Peoples. The Thracians, shielded perhaps by their mountainous inland territory, weathered this storm. They were not a centralized palace economy to be shattered. They were a network of tough, adaptable tribes. This period of chaos likely reinforced their martial character, solidifying their role as the formidable, warlike people who would soon step out of the prehistoric mist and onto the stage of recorded history, where their new neighbors, the Greeks, were waiting with parchment and a pen, ready to write down what they saw. As the Greek world slowly climbed out of the darkness that followed the Bronze Age collapse, its poets began to sing of an age of heroes, a semi-mythical past where gods and mortals mingled on the battlefield. It is in the foundational epic of Western literature, the Iliad, that the Thracians make their grand literary debut, and their entrance is nothing short of spectacular. We are at the siege of Troy, and the desperate Trojans call upon their allies. From the north, a new contingent arrives, led by the Thracian king Rhesus. He does not appear as a crude barbarian. He appears as a vision. The poet Homer, his voice echoing through the centuries, describes Rhesus's chariot and armor as being wrought of gold, glittering like the sun, and his horses as magnificent creatures, whiter than snow and faster than the wind, a description that would forever link Thrace with supernatural wealth and peerless horsemanship. Rhesus, in Homer's telling, is not a savage, but a king whose war gear is a marvel to behold. Equipment, the poet muses, that is fit not for mortal men, but for the immortal gods. This glittering image, however, is immediately paired with a sense of foreign danger and perhaps a touch of Greek condescension. That very night, acting on intelligence, the Greek heroes Odysseus and Diomedes infiltrate the Trojan camp. They find the Thracians asleep, exhausted from their long march, their sentries unposted. In the silent darkness, they slaughter Rhesus and 12 of his men, stealing the magnificent horses before melting back into the shadows. The episode is brief, but it is profoundly revealing. It establishes the core of the Greek perception of the Thracians. They are formidable, wealthy, and exotic, hailing from a cold land of wind and snow, yet they are also incautious, undisciplined, and ultimately fatally vulnerable to the cunning, pragmatic intellect of the Greeks. They are figures of tragedy and awe, but not, in the Greek mind, of logos, of reason. This story, whether it records a true Bronze Age memory or a later invention, became the archetype. From this poetic beginning, the Thracian reputation was built. The Greeks, as they began to establish colonies along the northern Aegean coast, came into direct, often violent contact with the tribes of the interior. Their writers, from the historian Herodotus to the philosopher Plato, began to sketch a portrait of a people who were their polar opposites. The Thracians became the essential other, the mirror in which Hellenic civilization defined itself. Where the Greeks valued moderation, sophrosin, the Thracians were seen as creatures of excess, given to wild, ecstatic rituals, deep drinking, and raw, unfiltered emotion. The very gods of this untamed passion, Ares, the god of brutal, chaotic war, and Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and religious ecstasy, were both believed by the Greeks to have their origins and true homes in Thrace. Ares, they said, was born in the snowy Haemus Mountains, and the Thracians were his chosen people, delighting in battle for its own sake. This wildness was not just a literary trope, it was rooted in observation. Thracian warriors, as we will see, fought differently, with a ferocity that terrified the disciplined Greek hoplite. Their rituals, too, were unsettling. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, recounts their customs with a fascinated anthropological eye. He describes their funeral rites as beginning not with quiet sorrow, but with a great howling lamentation, a planctus, an unrestrained outpouring of grief that seemed barbaric to the more restrained Greeks. He noted that they were polygamous, with kings and nobles maintaining many wives. He also noted the practice of tattooing, which for the Thracians was a mark of high birth and nobility, a sign that you did not have to labor in the fields. To the Greeks, who associated tattoos with slaves and criminals, this was a perfect example of barbarian inversion, a world turned upside down. Yet this image of the wild, war-loving savage is complicated by the second, equally powerful Thracian archetype, the musician. For just as Thrace was the mythical home of Ares, it was also the birthplace of Orpheus, the poet and singer of divine skill, the son of the muse Calliope. Orpheus was not a warrior. He was a master of the lyre, an artist whose music was so pure and powerful that it could charm the very stones, trees, and wild beasts of his homeland. He could tame the untamable. This figure, this Thracian Orpheus, represented an entirely different aspect of the barbarian soul, a sublime, natural, and almost pre-civilized genius. This paradox, that the same people could produce both the frenzied, wine-torn rituals of Dionysus and the serene, world-ordering music of Orpheus, fascinated the Greeks. It suggested that Thrace was a land of primordial power, a place where the barriers between the human, the animal, and the divine were dangerously thin. Other mythic musicians, like Thamyris, who dared to challenge the muses themselves, and Eumolpus, who was said to have founded the sacred Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, were also given Thracian origins. It was as if the Greeks acknowledged that the barbarians, to their north, possessed a deep, primal connection to the spiritual and artistic forces of the world, a connection that they, the civilized, had perhaps traded for logic and order. This complex, contradictory reputation, formidable in war, wild in spirit, sublime in art, would follow the Thracians throughout their history. They were the horse tamers, the gold workers, the drinkers of unmixed wine, the tattooed warriors of the mountain, and the singers of divine songs. They were, as Herodotus famously observed, a people of immense potential, who, if they were ruled by one man, or could agree among themselves, would be the most powerful of all nations. But they could not agree, and so they remained, in the Greek imagination, a force of nature rather than a coherent state, a human storm, beautiful and terrifying, gathering on the northern horizon. That famous observation from Herodotus that the Thracians would be unconquerable if only they could unite was not merely a passing political comment. It was the fundamental truth of their existence, the key that unlocks their entire history. To speak of Thrace in the ancient world was not to speak of a country, a kingdom, or a state, but rather of a vast shared cultural space, a human geography defined by language, custom, and belief. The Thracians were an ethno-linguistic family, much like the Celts of Western Europe or the Scythians of the steppe. They were a constellation of peoples, not a single star, and the force that kept them perpetually fragmented was the land itself. Their home, the eastern Balkan Peninsula, is a place sculpted by mountains. It is a fortress of ridges, a labyrinth of deep valleys and winding river gorges, a land dominated by the Great Haemus Range, the Balkan Mountains to the north and the deep forested Rhodope Mountains to the south. This geography was a cradle for tribalism. It did not offer open plains, like Egypt or Mesopotamia, to be easily unified by a single dynasty. Instead, it offered natural, defensible pockets, high strongholds, and secluded valleys where individual tribes could flourish, developing their own identities while fiercely guarding their autonomy. For centuries, this was the unchanging reality. The Thracian world was a mosaic of over 40 distinct tribes, whose names have come down to us through the records of the Greeks who traded, fought, and settled near them. In the very heart of the land, inhabiting the wide, fertile valley of the Hebrus River, the waterway we now call the Maritsa, lived the Odrysians. They were a powerful and numerous people, occupying the most strategic and productive land in all of Thrace, a central plain that offered pathways to the Aegean, the Black Sea, and the Danube. It is no surprise, then, that it would be the Odrysians who would eventually, and for a brief, brilliant moment, achieve the unity Herodotus mused about, a story we shall come to. But for now, they were simply the most prominent among many equals, their power centered on their agricultural wealth and their control of the river valley. To their south and west, high in the remote, imposing Rhodope Mountains, lived the Bessi. If the Odrysians were the political opportunists of the plains, the Bessi were the stern, unyielding guardians of the highlands. They were a famously fierce and independent tribe, a people of the forest and the rock, so insulated by their mountain strongholds that they would be among the very last Thracians to ever fall under Roman rule, centuries down our path. But their importance was not just military, it was spiritual. The Bessi were the protectors of the most sacred site in Thrace, the great mountain oracle of Dionysus, a place of prophecy whose fame rivaled that of Delphi in Greece. They were a tribe of priests and warriors, their identity inextricably bound to the ancient, ecstatic cults of their mountain god, a role that gave them immense prestige, if not political control, over their neighbors. If you were to travel north from the Haemus Mountains and cross the great river Ister, the mighty Danube, you would enter the lands of the Getae. The Getae, and their close kin the Dacians, inhabited the plains of modern Wallachia and the forested slopes of the Carpathian Mountains in what is now Romania. While sharing the Thracian language and core beliefs, their devotion to the god Zalmoxis would become legendary. Their unique geography placed them on a different historical trajectory. They were the northern frontier of the Thracian world, their neighbors not the Greeks, but the horse-riding Scythians of the steppe, from whom they learned new styles of warfare and art. Their story, for a time, runs parallel to that of their southern cousins, until they too forge a mighty and famously doomed kingdom of their own. And the list continues, a roll call of warrior societies. In the northwest, along the Danube's southern plains, were the Triballi, a large and formidable confederation known even among the Thracians for their wildness and martial prowess, a people who would prove a thorn in the side of even Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great. Along the Aegean coast, tribes like the Sapaeans and the Bistonians lived in uneasy proximity to the Greek colonies, sometimes trading, sometimes raiding, their lands rich in timber for ships and access to the lucrative coastal trade routes. Each of these tribes was ruled by its own basileus, a Greek word we translate as king, but which should more accurately be understood as a chieftain or a local dynast. His power was not absolute or bureaucratic, it was personal. It was earned and held through prowess in battle, through the loyalty of his warrior retinue, and through his ability to dispense wealth, which he acquired through raids, tribute from his neighbors, and control of gold and silver mines. This was a heroic society, not unlike the one Homer described for the Mycenaean Greeks. Power was fluid and dynastic. When a strong king died, his territory was often divided among his sons, shattering any nascent unity. The archaeological record confirms this political fragmentation. While we find a shared Thracian culture in the burial practices and the reverence for horses, the specific artifacts, the designs on a silver drinking cup, the shape of a bronze helmet, the decorative motifs on horse harnesses, show distinct regional variations. The treasures we unearth belonged to these chieftains, not to a state. This landscape of competing warrior aristocracies, this constant low-level warfare, was the status quo for centuries. It defined the Thracian character, making them resilient, adaptable, and formidable as individual fighters, but vulnerable as a whole. This disunity, this mosaic of tribes, was the very fabric of their world, a fabric that was about to be seized and rewoven by the ambitions of two of the world's greatest empires, first from the east and then from within. Into this fragmented world of mountain strongholds and competing tribal chieftains, a new unifying force was about to arrive, not from within, but from the east. It came as a storm, an organized imperial tempest of a scale the Thracians, in all their centuries of localized warfare, could never have imagined. This was the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and its ruler was Darius the Great, a king whose ambition stretched from the Indus Valley to the edges of the known world. Around 513 BC, Darius fixed his gaze upon the lands beyond the Bosphorus, not initially for Thrace itself, but for what lay beyond it. His true target was the nomadic, elusive Scythians who roamed the vast steppes north of the Danube, and who had, in the past, raided his own territories. Thrace, in the grand imperial calculation of the Persians, was simply the land bridge, the necessary corridor through which his armies must pass to punish his nomadic enemies. The crossing itself was a wonder of ancient engineering and a terrifying spectacle. Darius's army, numbering in the hundreds of thousands according to Herodotus, a likely exaggeration, but still a force of unprecedented size, did not cross the sea. Instead, They built a bridge of boats, a pontoon bridge lashed together across the narrow strait of the Bosphorus, and the armies of Asia marched, for the first time in recorded history, into the continent of Europe. The Thracian tribes of the coast, witnessing this endless river of men, horses, and supply wagons, largely submitted without a fight, their local kings offering the traditional Persian symbols of submission, earth, and water. They were pragmatic, and what they saw on the horizon was not a rival tribe to be fought, but a force of nature to be weathered. Not all of Thrace, however, bent the knee so easily. The historian Herodotus, our primary, if not always impartial, guide to these events, pauses to give special note to one northern tribe. The Getae, he says, who lived near the crossing of the Danube, behaved with the greatest folly, and were subdued at once, though they are the most valiant and the most just of all the Thracians. This single sentence is revealing. It shows the Getae resisting an impossible force, and it shows the Greek historians grudging respect for them, a respect that already paints the Thracians in a light of noble, if doomed, courage. The other tribes of the interior, particularly those in the high mountains, likely did what they had always done when faced with an overwhelming foe. They vanished. They melted into the forests and ridges of the Haemus and Rhodope, offering no pitched battle, no single target for the Persian war machine to destroy, choosing instead a path of temporary invisibility. Darius marched north, crossed the Danube on another boat bridge built by his Ionian Greek subjects, and vanished into the steppe in pursuit of the Scythians. The campaign was a strategic failure. The Scythians, masters of the grassland, refused to give battle, luring the Persians deeper and deeper into an empty land until the great king, his supply lines stretched to the breaking point, was forced to retreat. But this retreat was not a defeat for his Thracian ambitions. He had not come to Thrace to conquer it, but he would not leave it empty-handed. He left behind a massive army, tens of thousands of soldiers under his trusted general, Megabazus, with a new, clear mission: to systematically pacify the entire region and formally annex it into the empire. This was the birth of the satrapy of Scudra. Thrace, or at least its most valuable coastal and lowland territories, became a formal province of the Persian Empire. This was not a raid, it was an occupation. Persian governors, garrisons, and administrators were installed. For the first time, a single external power imposed an overarching political structure on the warring Thracian tribes. This occupation, which would last for more than 3 decades, was a profound cultural and political shock. The immediate burden was tribute. The Thracian kings, now vassals of Darius, were required to send gold, silver, grain, and most importantly, men. Thracian warriors, prized for their ferocity, were conscripted as auxiliaries into the Persian army. From this moment on, the iconic Thracian peltast, with his crescent-shaped shield and javelins, and the elite Thracian cavalry, began to serve the great king, fighting his battles far from their homeland. This forced contact with the wider empire also brought a new layer of cultural influence. Persian art, with its formal processions, its stylized animals, and its majestic sense of order, began to mingle with the native Thracian traditions. Thracian craftsmen, particularly the masters of gold and silver, began to see and adapt Achaemenid motifs. This fusion of styles, this blend of wild Thracian vitality and elegant Persian refinement, would create some of the most spectacular treasures of the ancient world, artifacts that absorbed the influence of the occupier and transformed it into something new, something uniquely Thracian. The Persian presence, while oppressive, had effectively put a lid on the simmering pot of intertribal warfare. It forced a kind of bitter peace on the lowlands. But this peace was only as strong as the Persian army that enforced it. When Persia's attention turned south to its fateful climactic wars with the Greek city-states, that strength began to waver. Thracian troops marched with Xerxes in his massive invasion of Greece in 480 BC, forced to fight against their neighbors. But when that invasion force was shattered at Plataea and the Persian navy broken at Mycale in 479 BC, the empire's hold on its European foothold became untenable. The garrisons of Scudra were cut off, their power collapsing. The Persians retreated, leaving behind a land fundamentally changed, a land where the old tribal order had been broken and where a power vacuum now waited, inviting a new native ambition to fill it. The Persian storm had passed, its imperial armies broken in the south by the allied Greeks, its garrisons in Thrace cut off and retreating back to Asia. The year was 479 BC, and the land bridge of Scudra, the Achaemenid province, dissolved as if it had never been. But the storm had done more than just pass over. It had scoured the landscape, irrevocably altering the political terrain. The decades of foreign occupation, of centralized tribute and imposed order, had broken the old, localized patterns of tribal life. A generation had grown up knowing a power greater than their local chieftain. Now, with that power gone, Thrace did not simply revert to its former state of fragmented chaos. Instead, a vacuum had been created, a space now filled with a new, grander ambition, an idea that had perhaps been impossible before the Persians showed what a unified command could achieve. This opportunity would be seized not by a committee or a confederation, but by a single man of extraordinary vision and ruthless pragmatism, a man emerging from the very heart of Thrace. His name was Thrace, and he was a king of the Odrysians. We know almost nothing of his early life, his parentage, or his rise to power within his own tribe. He steps onto the stage of history in the pages of the Greek historian Thucydides as a fully formed political force. The Odrysians, as we recall, were perfectly placed for this moment. They controlled the wide, fertile valley of the Hebrus River, the modern Maritsa, the great artery of Thrace that connects the mountains to the Aegean Sea. This gave them agricultural wealth, manpower, and control over the most important trade routes. Thrace, described by Thucydides simply as a man of great ability, understood that the old ways of intertribal raiding were a dead end. The future and the immense wealth it promised lay in consolidation. He would not just be a king of the Odrysians, he would be the king of all the Thracians he could reach. Thrace began his life's work not with a single grand proclamation, but with a relentless, patient, and multi-pronged strategy. He was a master of the tools of Thracian statecraft, dynastic marriage, personal diplomacy, and overwhelming force. He recognized that the greatest threat to a nascent kingdom in the plains was the restless nomadic power of the Scythians to the north, across the Danube. To secure this frontier, he did not wage war. He made an alliance, marrying his own daughter to the Scythian king Ariapeithes, a brilliant move that turned a potential enemy into a family relation and secured his rear. With his northern border quieted, Terrace turned his gaze south, east, and west. He began the long, hard process of forging a kingdom from the mosaic of disparate tribes. This was not a war of national liberation, it was a Thracian imposing his will upon other Thracians. His methods were practical and effective. To some tribes, he likely offered a partnership, a promise of stability, and a greater share of the wealth that came from controlling trade with the Greek coastal cities. To others who resisted, he brought the full force of his Odrysian cavalry, a mounted aristocracy that was the core of his power. He absorbed the lands of one tribe after another, until by the middle of the 5th century BC, he commanded a territory that stretched from the Black Sea in the east, nearly to the river Strymon in the west, and from the Danube in the north down to the Aegean coast. He had done it. He had created the Odrysian kingdom, the first great native state in European history north of the Greek city-states, a vast tribal empire that finally fulfilled Herodotus's prophecy. This kingdom, however, looked nothing like the centralized bureaucratic empire of the Persians he had replaced, nor did it resemble the polis-based civilization of the Greeks. It was a super tribe, a sprawling confederation held together by the personal authority of Terrace himself and by a web of tribute and obligation. The dozens of smaller Thracian tribes, like the Bessi and the Triballi, still existed. Their local kings and chieftains still ruled their own valleys and mountains, but they now did so as vassals of Terrace. Their primary duty was twofold: to pay tribute, a river of gold, silver, grain, timber, and valuable hides that flowed into the Odrysian royal coffers, and to provide troops, swelling the king's armies with their specialized infantry and cavalry. This system concentrated a staggering amount of wealth into the hands of a single dynasty. It was this Odrysian-controlled wealth that would fund the creation of the spectacular gold and silver treasures that now fill the museums of Bulgaria, and it was this wealth that paid for the construction of the magnificent tombs like Kazanlak for this new, powerful aristocracy. The Odrysian kingdom had no single fixed capital city. Terrace and his successors ruled from the saddle. The king and his court, a vast retinue of hetairoi, his noble companions and cavalrymen, were perpetually in motion. They moved in a grand procession from one tribal center to another, from one fortified hilltop residence to the next, consuming the tribute of the land, feasting with local vassals, dispensing justice, and reminding all of Thrace exactly who was in charge. This was a government as a performance, a constant demonstration of personal power. The king's presence was the state. Terrace, legend holds, lived to the remarkable age of 92, dying not in battle, but of illness, a testament to his political skill in a world where most warrior kings met a violent end. He had laid the foundation, a massive, rich, and inherently volatile entity, built on the foundations of Persian administration, but animated by a Thracian spirit. He left this new, formidable power to his son, Sitalces, who would not be content to merely consolidate, but would seek to expand and to test the Odrysian kingdom against the greatest power of the age, Athens itself. When the long, remarkably stable reign of Terrace came to its natural end, the vast, newly forged Odrysian kingdom did not fragment. It passed, intact and formidable, into the hands of his son, Sitalces. If Terrace had been the architect, a man of patience, diplomacy, and strategic construction, Sitalces was the warrior king incarnate, possessing all his father's ambition, but with a more restless, martial energy. The Greek historian Thucydides, a contemporary observer and our invaluable guide to this era, describes Sitalces as a formidable figure, a man who not only consolidated his father's vast network of vassal tribes, but actively expanded it, pushing the kingdom's borders further west, subjugating tribes that Thrace had left untouched. He perfected the system of tribute, and the river of gold, silver, grain, and manpower flowing into his mobile court became a torrent. The Odrysian kingdom, under Sitalces, was about to reach its absolute, terrifying zenith. Its power felt far beyond the mountains of Thrace, becoming a decisive factor in the great power struggle of the age. This struggle was, of course, the Peloponnesian War, the generation-spanning, world-altering conflict between democratic, naval Athens and the oligarchic, land-based power of Sparta. In the opening years of this war, Athens found itself in a difficult position. The Spartans, led by Archidamus, invaded their homeland of Attica every year, forcing the rural population to crowd behind the long walls of the city, a strategy that would soon give rise to a devastating plague. Athens needed allies, and it needed resources. Its gaze turned north to the barbarian kingdom of Sitalces, a land rich in everything Athens lacked: timber for its all-important fleet, vast reserves of grain, and most critically, a seemingly inexhaustible supply of the most feared light infantry in the ancient world. In 431 BC, the very year the war began, Athenian diplomats secured a formal alliance. In exchange for Odrysian gold and prestige, Sitalces promised to provide Athens with troops and cavalry. This was a stunning geopolitical development. The most sophisticated polis in Greece was now the formal ally of the Thracian super-tribe. For 2 years, the alliance was mostly theoretical, until Athenian interests in the northern Aegean were directly threatened. The king of Macedon, Perdiccas II, a famously slippery and unreliable opportunist, was causing trouble for Athens, actively supporting its enemies in the Chalcidice region. Athens, busy with the plague and the Spartan invasions, decided to call in its new, powerful northern friend. They requested Sitalces to fulfill his treaty obligations, invade Macedon, depose Perdiccas, and restore order to the region. Sitalces, eager perhaps to demonstrate his power to the Greek world and to claim Macedon as his own vassal, agreed. What he did next, in the autumn of 429 BC, sent a shockwave of terror across the entire Greek peninsula. He did not send an expeditionary force. He called in every marker, every tribal obligation, every vassal levy from the full, staggering breadth of his kingdom. Thucydides, who clearly had access to excellent sources on this campaign, describes the army that Sitalces assembled with a tone of undisguised awe. This was not a typical Greek army of a few thousand hoplites. It was a human deluge, a migration on the march. At its core was the elite Odrysian cavalry, the king's personal retinue, clad in armor and followed by their own infantry. But the vast bulk of the force was made of the independent Thracian tribes from the mountains and plains, each marching under its own chieftain, all now answering the call of the Odrysian king. From the high Rhodopis came the fierce, independent Bessi and their neighbors. From the north, across the Danube, came the Getae, prized for their horse archers, Scythian style. Even the wild Triballi, often enemies of the Odrysians, were swept up in the mobilization. Thucydides claims The total number approached 150,000 men, a third of them cavalry. This figure is almost certainly an exaggeration, a number perhaps circulated by Sitalce's own heralds to inspire terror, or a Greek's fearful estimate of an incomprehensible barbarian host. But even if the truth was a third of that 50,000 men, it was still the largest army that had been seen in Europe since the Persian invasion, and it was now moving south with a single purpose. The kingdom of Macedon, which would one day conquer the known world, was utterly unprepared. Sitalce's army swept over the border like a natural disaster, a land tsunami of men and horses. They ravaged the countryside, burning crops, sacking towns, and taking plunder. The Macedonians, Thucydides reports, were paralyzed by terror, and King Perdiccas II dared not meet them in the field. He and his people abandoned the countryside and huddled behind their few fortified city walls, watching as the Thracian tide consumed their entire kingdom. Sitalces and his host continued their march, sweeping through Macedon and into the Chalcidice, ravaging the territories of Athens' enemies. The Odrysian kingdom had arrived indisputably as a great power, but this grand display of force concealed a fatal structural weakness. Sitalces' army was a plunder-based host, not a professional state-supplied siege army. It could only survive by constantly moving and consuming the resources of the land it occupied. It had no complex supply lines, no siege engineers, no patience for the long, grinding work of reducing fortified cities. Sitalces had expected to rendezvous with the Athenian fleet, which had promised to arrive with hoplites and siege equipment to jointly capture the rebel cities. But the Athenians, in a spectacular failure of diplomacy, never came. Thucydides suggests they were either delayed by other war matters, or more likely, they did not believe he would come, and even when he did, they were frightened at the size of his army. They simply did not show up, leaving their most powerful ally stranded. As the campaign dragged on for 30 days, the Thracian army ate the land bare. Winter was approaching, the weather was turning cold, and the troops, laden with plunder, were growing restless. Perdiccas of Macedon, a master of back-channel diplomacy, secretly bribed Sitalces' influential nephew, Suthus, to persuade the king to leave. Sitalces, frustrated by his absent allies and facing a logistical crisis, simply declared victory and turned the entire massive host around. The great storm receded as quickly as it had arrived, vanishing back into the Thracian heartland, leaving a devastated but unconquered Macedon behind. The kingdom's zenith had been reached. It had proven it could unite, but it also proved its power was as fleeting as a summer tempest. The vast, terrifying army of Sitalces, which had descended upon Macedon like a human flood, was not a force that a Greek commander would have easily recognized or understood. It was not a gleaming, orderly wall of bronze shields, a phalanx marching in lockstep to the sound of a flute. It was something far older, wilder, and perhaps in its own element, far more lethal. The power of the Odrysian king, and indeed the military reputation of all the Thracian tribes, was not built on the disciplined, armored hoplite, the master of the pitched, decisive battle on an open plain. It was built instead upon the warrior who dominated the broken ground, the forest, and the hillside. This was the realm of the peltast, and he was the iconic, asymmetrical, and deeply unsettling genius of Thracian warfare. To understand the peltast, one must first understand his Greek counterpart, the hoplite. The hoplite was a walking fortress, clad in bronze greaves, a cuirass, and a heavy helmet. He carried the aspis, a massive, round, concave shield of wood and bronze, and his primary weapon was a long, heavy-thrusting spear. He was an instrument of the polis, an amateur soldier citizen, and his entire philosophy of war was based on cohesion, weight, and the collective grinding push of the phalanx. He was, in essence, a land-based battleship, immensely powerful in a head-on collision, but slow, ponderous, and utterly vulnerable if his formation broke or if he was caught on rough terrain. The Thracian peltast was the precise and deliberate opposite of this. He was the torpedo boat, built for speed, maneuverability, and the hit-and-run sting. The peltast was defined by what he lacked. He wore almost no armor, perhaps a simple leather or linen tunic, high, soft boots of deerskin that gripped the rock, and the characteristic Phrygian cap, a soft, conical hat with a forward-pointing peak that became synonymous with the Thracians. His only defense was the shield that gave him his name, the pelt. This was not the heavy aspis of the Greek. It was a light, crescent-shaped or sometimes oval shield made of wicker or wood, covered in stretched animal hide. It was not designed to stop a heavy spear thrust, but to deflect a glancing blow, to be held aloft while running, to be a minimal, agile encumbrance. His weapons were not for the crush of battle, but for the skirmish. He carried not one heavy spear, but a clutch of light, thin javelins, often 3 or 4, with small, sharp, metal tips. For close work, he carried a short, wicked sword or a long dagger, but if he was forced to use it, his primary advantage was already lost. The tactics of the peltast were a terrifying innovation, a form of asymmetric warfare that deeply frustrated the classical Greek mind. A phalanx would advance, a solid wall of men, expecting a similar force to meet it. Instead, from the cover of woods, or from the rocky slopes of a hill, the peltasts would emerge, not in a line, but in a loose, fluid swarm. They would sprint forward to the very edge of archery range, unleash a sudden, rattling volley of javelins into the dense Greek ranks, and then, just as the enraged hoplites prepared to charge, they would turn and flee. The Greeks, steeped in a heroic code that equated running with cowardice, would often break formation, their fastest and angriest men charging after the retreating barbarians. This was the trap. The unarmored Thracians, masters of their terrain, would simply lope away, disappearing back into the hills, easily outpacing the hoplite who was carrying 70 pounds of bronze. Once the Greek charge was exhausted, their formation scattered, their men breathless and frustrated, the peltasts would regroup, turn, and hurl another volley. This was a war of psychological attrition. It was, to the Greek hoplite, a profoundly ignoble way to fight. It was war without the heroic agon, the decisive moment of shield-on-shield collision. It was being stung to death by a swarm of insects you could not catch. The javelins found the gaps in the bronze, the unshielded right side of the phalanx, the eyes, the throats, the legs. It was a slow, agonizing, and deeply demoralizing process. This tactic, born from the mountainous Thracian landscape, was perfected into a lethal art form. The Greeks, for all their disdain, were forced to learn and adapt, or to suffer. The Athenian general Xenophon, in his famous March of the 10,000, describes in his Anabasis how his heavy infantry force, deep in hostile territory, was mercilessly savaged by local tribes fighting in precisely this manner, until he was forced to create his own specialized corps of light infantry just to counter them. The prowess of the Peltast did not go unnoticed. As the city-states of Greece wore each other down, their citizen armies were increasingly supplemented by paid professionals. The Thracian Peltast, along with the Cretan archer and the Rhodian slinger, became one of the most sought-after and expensive mercenaries in the Mediterranean world. Athenian generals, in particular, learned their value. In the Peloponnesian War, at the Battle of Sphacteria in 425 BC, a force of elite Spartan hoplites was trapped on an island. The Athenians, in a shocking display of this new warfare, landed a force made largely of light infantry and peltasts, who over the course of a day rained missiles down on the Spartans, refusing all close engagement. The Spartans, unable to close with their tormentors, their bronze armor no defense against the constant barrage, were eventually forced into the unthinkable. They surrendered. The event sent a tremor through all of Greece. The barbarian tactic had defeated the invincible Spartan hoplite. This, then, was the military engine of the Odrysian kingdom. Sitalce's power was not just in his numbers, but in the fact that his kingdom was the primary recruiting ground for the most effective light infantry of the age, a resource he could either unleash on his enemies, as he did in Macedon, or sell to his allies, as he did with Athens, funding his vast gold-rich court. While the Thracian Peltast was busy rewriting the rules of warfare on the battlefields of Greece, another aspect of Thracian culture was infiltrating the Hellenic world in a far more subtle yet equally profound way. This was not a military tactic, but a spiritual one, a divine import that traveled not with javelin volleys, but with the scent of pine torches and the sound of nocturnal hymns. To understand the Thracians, we must move beyond their formidable warriors and peer into the shadows of their forests, into the heart of their religious life, which was as untamed and ecstatic as their battle cries. And the perfect gateway into this world is through the cult of a goddess who made the extraordinary leap from the Thracian wilderness into the very heart of Athens, the great goddess Bendis. We are in the cool, pine-scented hills of Thrace, far from any city, and the sun has long since set. The moon, her celestial counterpart, casts a high silver light over the rocky clearings. Here, in the sacred precincts of the forest, the rituals begin. Bendis was a goddess of the wild, a mistress of the hunt, a queen of the moon and the night, and her worship was not a quiet, orderly daylight affair. It was a thing of torches, of running, and of ecstatic release. The Greeks, ever tidy in their divine classifications, saw her and immediately associated her with their own Artemis, the virgin huntress. But Bendis was something older, earthier, and to the Greek mind, undeniably foreign. She was often depicted not as a serene Olympian, but in full Thracian attire, the familiar pointed Phrygian cap upon her head, a cloak of fox fur draped over her shoulders, and high, soft hunting boots. In her hands she carried not a bow, but 2 spears, like the peltasts we have just observed, a goddess who was both a hunter and a warrior. Her festivals, the Bendidia, were famous for their nocturnal character. We can imagine the scene, a great procession gathering at dusk, the air growing sharp with the smell of burning resin. The worshippers, both men and women, would light torches, creating a river of fire that moved through the darkened woods. There was music, the high, insistent piping of the aulos and the rhythmic pulse of drums that built an intensity, encouraging a state of religious excitement, a collective enthusiasm where the divine was felt to be present. This was not the sober ritual of an Athenian state procession, but something more primal, a celebration that embraced the wildness of the night itself. One of the central rites of her cult was a lampadodromia, a torch race, often conducted on horseback, a spectacular and chaotic display of Thracian horsemanship and devotion, the riders galloping through the darkness with their flames held high. This vibrant, torchlit cult was not confined to the Thracian mountains. It traveled, as all powerful ideas do, carried by the people who believed in it. Thracian mercenaries, serving in the Athenian army, brought their goddess with them. Thracian merchants and slaves, living in the bustling cosmopolitan port of Athens, the Piraeus, built small shrines to her, and the Athenians, it seems, were captivated. This barbarian goddess offered something their own august pantheon, dwelling high on the Acropolis, did not. She offered a direct, emotional, and ecstatic connection to the divine, a spirituality of the night that resonated in a time of war and uncertainty. The cult grew first unofficially, and then, in a move that is truly astonishing, the Athenian state gave it official recognition. The opening lines of Plato's Republic, perhaps the single most famous work of Western philosophy, are not a dry, abstract pronouncement. They are, instead, a piece of reportage that plunges us directly into this moment of cultural fusion. Socrates, the narrator, famously begins, "I went down yesterday to the Piraeus with Glaucon to pay my devotions to the goddess, and also because I wished to see how they would conduct the festival, since this was its first celebration." He is speaking of the Bendidia, its inaugural state-sanctioned event, likely around 429 BC. Socrates notes the novelty, the excitement. He observes two processions, one of the native Athenians, and another, which he concedes was no less brilliant, of the Thracians themselves. He then mentions the main event, the novel feature of the evening, the torch race on horseback. This was a novelty. We must pause to appreciate the significance of this. Athens, the city-state that defined itself by its intellectual superiority and its distinction from barbarians, had officially imported a Thracian goddess into its pantheon. This was not a casual act. It was a profound political and cultural statement. The timing around 429 BC is no coincidence. This was the exact same period that Sitalces, the mighty Odrysian king, was at the height of his power, a vital and terrifying ally to Athens in the Peloponnesian War. The official adoption of Bendis was, in part, a masterful stroke of diplomacy, a way of honoring their powerful northern allies, of binding the Odrysian kingdom and the many Thracian medics in the Piraeus more closely to the Athenian cause. But it cannot have been only political. For the cult to be embraced with such popular enthusiasm, as Plato's account suggests, it must have met a genuine spiritual need. The cult of Bendis in Athens became a place where Thracian and Athenian, slave and free, could mingle in a shared, ecstatic worship. It was a crack in the otherwise rigid wall of Hellenic identity, a testament to the fact that the flow of culture was not a one-way street, from the civilized to the barbarian. The Thracians, in this instance, were the exporters of a potent religious technology. Their goddess, born of the moonlit forest and the torch race, had proven to be as irresistible to the Athenian soul as their peltasts were essential to the Athenian army. A wild, divine energy that the city of logic had for a time found it necessary and beautiful to embrace. The nocturnal, torchlit cult of Bendis, which found such a surprising home in the Athenian port, was an export, a piece of the Thracian soul that proved adaptable and compelling to its neighbors. But to find the true, undiluted heart of Thracian ecstatic religion, we must journey away from the cosmopolitan coast, leaving the plains of the Odrysians behind. Our path leads us upward into the deep, winding valleys and fog-shrouded peaks of the Rhodope Mountains, a formidable range that formed the southern bastion of the Thracian heartland. This was a land of dense pine forests, of sheer limestone cliffs, and of a silence broken only by the cry of eagles and the rush of high, cold streams. This was the domain of the Bessi, a tribe we have met before, a people whose reputation for ferocity and independence was legendary, even among their fellow Thracians. The Bessi were not just warriors, they were the guardians, a tribe whose entire identity was fused with the spiritual power of their homeland. They were a people who, for centuries, stubbornly resisted the pull of the Odrysian kings, the ambitions of Macedon, and in the end, the legions of Rome. Their fierceness was not merely for political autonomy, it was a sacred duty, for they were the hereditary protectors of the single most important religious site in all of Thrace, a place whose fame echoed across the entire ancient world, rivaling even the great oracle of Apollo at Delphi. This was the sacred mountain sanctuary, the oracle of Dionysus. While the Greeks often claimed Dionysus as their own, they never forgot his origins, always referring to him as the Thracian god, a deity of wine, madness, and divine ecstasy whose cult had come to them from the wild north. And here, in the mountain fastness of the Bessi, was his source. We do not know the exact location of this oracle. Unlike Delphi, with its grand theater and temple ruins, the Thracian sanctuary was likely a place of natural, rugged awe, a high peak, a sacred grove, or a deep cave, a chasma, a place where the earth itself was felt to be thin, allowing the divine to speak. The ancient sources are tantalizingly vague, placing it on the highest peak of the Rhodope, a place that remained remote and difficult to access. This inaccessibility was part of its power, a pilgrimage site that demanded effort and purified the visitor through the journey itself. Here, in this wild place, the Bessi administered a form of prophecy that was as primal and elemental as the god himself. It was not a ritual of quiet riddles, but one of fire and wine. The Greek historian Herodotus is the first to describe it. He writes of a temple where priestesses would divine the future, but the chief promantis, the chief prophet, was a man, a high priest from the Bessi tribe. The Roman historian Suetonius, writing centuries later, gives us a more vivid and likely more accurate picture of the central rite. A petitioner would come, a question in his heart, and the Bessi priests would light a great fire upon a circular, open-air stone altar. As the flames grew, they would pour libations of pure, unmixed wine over the sacred embers. The god's answer came not in a human voice, but in the voice of the fire itself. If the wine was poured and the flame leaped high, a great, roaring column of fire reaching for the sky, it was a sign of immense favor, a yes of world-altering proportions. If the flame sputtered or the fire shrank, it was a dire omen. This was a yes or no oracle, but one delivered with spectacular elemental drama. This fusion of the sacred and the political was embodied in the rulers of the Bessi. They were not simply kings who patronized a cult. They were, in effect, priest kings. The high priest of the Dionysian oracle was the king of the Bessi tribe, a theocratic leader whose temporal power was indivisible from his spiritual authority. This gave the Bessi a unique and fearsome prestige. To attack them was not just an act of war, it was an act of sacrilege. This sacred trust explains their stubborn independence, an independence that would last for nearly 500 years after Siddlese's empire had risen and fallen. The fame of this wild, fiery oracle drew the most powerful men in the world to the Rhodope Mountains. It became a critical stop for any would-be conqueror. According to our Roman sources, two of the most significant prophecies in history were given here, both of them to men on the cusp of empire. The first came to Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander. He, and later his son, Alexander the Great, made the pilgrimage to the sanctuary. When Alexander himself made the sacrifice and the wine was poured, the priests were astounded. The flame, Suetonius tells us, leapt up so high that it went above the top of the sanctuary, a sign of unparalleled divine favor. The priests declared what Alexander already believed, that he was destined for the conquest of the world. Centuries later, as the Roman Republic was tearing itself apart, another ambitious father, Octavius, the father of the young man who would become the Emperor Augustus, traveled to the same sacred grove. He, too, consulted the oracle about his son's future, and again the miracle occurred. As the wine was poured, the flame shot up to the very sky, a prophecy that so perfectly mirrored Alexander's that it was taken as a sign that this new Roman youth, Octavian, would be his equal, a master of the world. Whether these stories are true or were later prophecies manufactured for imperial propaganda is almost irrelevant. What matters is that the oracle of the Bessi was the stage upon which these claims had to be made. Its authority was so absolute that its endorsement was sought by both Alexander and Augustus, the two most powerful men of the ancient world. For all those centuries, the Bessi, a small mountain tribe, held the keys to this divine legitimacy, their power not in a vast army, but in their role as the gatekeepers to the fiery, prophetic voice of the original Thracian god. The fiery oracle of the Bessi, high in the Rhodope peaks, offered a spectacular elemental communion with the divine, a yes or no written in a column of flame, sought by kings and conquerors. It was a prophecy for the world of the living, for armies and for empires. But the Thracian soul, in its complexity, was not satisfied with this alone. It also harbored a deeper, more personal, and far more revolutionary preoccupation, a profound questioning of death itself and a search for a pathway through it. From this same spiritually charged landscape, this world of mountains, forests, and ecstatic gods, emerged two of the ancient world's most compelling and competing mysteries of immortality, two answers to the final human question, embodied by two very different and equally shadowy prophets, Orpheus and Zalmoxis. Orpheus is the one whose name has echoed loudest through Western culture, a figure of sublime art and ultimate tragedy. He is, in the Greek tradition, the quintessential Thracian, yet he is the antithesis of the wild, drunken warrior. He is the son of a Thracian king, or perhaps the river god, Oeagrus, and most importantly, of the muse Calliope herself. He is a semi-divine artist, a prophet whose power lay not in a javelin or a fiery altar, but in a lyre. His music was not the frenzied drumming of the Dionysian rites. It was a sound of such transcendent purity and order that it charmed the very soul of the wild. When Orpheus sang, the Thracian wolves would lie down, the trees of the forest would bend their branches to listen, and the very rocks of the Haemus mountains would weep. He was, in essence, a civilizing force, a Thracian who could tame the Thracian wildness within nature, and by extension, within the human heart. His story is one of profound love and even more profound failure. His descent into the underworld to retrieve his lost wife, Eurydice, is a journey into the heart of the mystery. He charms Hades, the lord of the dead, and Persephone, his queen, with the sheer beauty of his sorrowful music, and they grant him the impossible, to lead his wife's soul back to the light. The one condition that he not look back proves to be a burden too great for his human love, and he loses her a second time, forever. This failure, this final loss, transforms him. He returns to the world of the living as a man set apart, a prophet who has seen the other side and has returned with its secrets. He shuns the world, wandering his native Thrace, singing only to the rocks and trees. His end is famously violent. He is torn to pieces by the Maenads, the frenzied female followers of Dionysus, enraged that his serene Apollonian music rejects their own ecstatic god. This mythic conflict, Orpheus versus Dionysus, is a perfect allegory for the two poles of Thracian spirituality, the personal, ascetic path versus the collective, ecstatic one. From this life and this death, a complex system of belief arose, a mystery cult known as Orphism. It was not a state religion, but a personal soteriological path, a way of life for individuals seeking salvation. Its core tenets were radical. Orphism taught a profound dualism, that the human being was a composite of two warring natures. We possess a pure, divine, immortal soul, a spark of Dionysus himself, which is trapped within a profane, mortal, earthly body, the tomb of the flesh, inherited from the Titans who first dismembered the god. Life on earth, therefore, was not a gift, but a prison. The soul was bound to a grievous wheel of metempsychosis, or reincarnation, forced to return to the world again and again in different bodies, both human and animal, in a long, sorrowful cycle of suffering. The only way to escape this wheel was through the Orphic initiation. This required a life of purity and asceticism that was utterly alien to the feasting, polygamous warrior aristocracy of Thrace. Orphics were often vegetarians, refusing to eat the flesh of unsouled beings. They followed complex rules of ritual purity, and most critically, they relied on sacred texts. While the Thracians were a resolutely non-literate people, Orphism was a bookish religion, centered on a body of sacred poems and hymns said to have been written by Orpheus himself. We have found the most personal and moving evidence of this cult in the form of small, delicate gold tablets buried with initiates and graves across Thrace and the Greek world. These tablets, inscribed in Greek, were a kind of passport for the afterlife, a cheat sheet for the wandering soul, containing the passwords needed to navigate the underworld. I am a child of earth and starry heaven. One reads, but my race is of heaven alone. I am parched with thirst, and I am dying. Give me quickly the cold water flowing from the lake of memory. Orphism was an intellectual, deeply personal, and text-based path for the individual soul to reclaim its divine origin and escape the body forever. While Orpheus offered an escape from the wheel of rebirth, a very different promise of immortality was being made far to the north, across the Danube, in the lands of the Getae. Here, the central figure was Zalmoxis. The ever-curious Herodotus, our primary source, was deeply perplexed by this god. He presents us with two competing stories. The first, which he clearly learned from the Greeks living on the Black Sea coast, is a rationalizing, skeptical tale. In this version, Zalmoxis was not a god, but a mortal man, a Thracian who had been a slave to the great philosopher Pythagoras in Samos. From Pythagoras, he had learned the Ionian way of life and the deeper truths, specifically the doctrine of the soul's immortality. Upon gaining his freedom, he returned to his rude and dull-witted Getian kinsmen who were still living in mean dwellings. He built a great andron, a men's feasting hall, where he would dine with the chief nobles of the Getae, teaching them that neither he nor his guests nor their descendants would ever die, but would go to a place where they would live forever and have all good things. To prove his point, the story claims Zalmoxis had an underground chamber built. He finished his teachings, vanished from the sight of the Getae, and lived in this secret dwelling for 3 full years. The Getae, believing him dead, mourned him deeply. Then, in the 4th year, he suddenly re-emerged, as if resurrected, thus proving his doctrine. Herodotus himself, however, admits his deep skepticism of this tale, noting that he believes Zalmoxis lived many years before Pythagoras and was likely a native Thracian daimon or divine spirit all along. This second, more primal Zalmoxis is revealed in the Getae's actual worship. They did not believe, Herodotus says, that they died, but that they simply went to Zalmoxis. Their belief in this collective afterlife was so absolute that it manifested in a shocking ritual. Every 4 years, they would choose a messenger by lot, a man tasked with carrying the tribe's needs and requests to the god. They post men in a row, 3 of them holding spears, Herodotus recounts, while others take the messenger by his hands and feet, swing him, and toss him into the air so that he lands on the spearheads. If the man died quickly, it was a sign the god was favorable. If he survived the fall, they call him a bad man, and they send another. History, it seems, can be a harsh employer. These 2 paths, both born from the Thracian obsession with the afterlife, could not be more different. Orphism was an individualist, text-based, philosophical mystery of escape, a way for the single soul to purify itself and leave the mortal world behind. Zalmoxism was a collective, tribal, and shamanic cult of continuity, a belief that the tribe as a whole would persist, unified with their god, a belief sealed not with a golden tablet, but with the ritual sacrifice of a human messenger. One was a path of the book, the other a path of the spear. The rich, complex, and often contradictory spiritual landscape of Thrace, with its fiery oracles and its competing paths to immortality, was a product of its long, fragmented independence. This independence, however, was not destined to last. While the Thracian tribes looked inward to their gods and the once mighty Odrysian kingdom, following the death of Sitalces, had begun to fracture, a new, cold and calculating shadow was creeping up from the southwest. This shadow was cast by a kingdom that Sitalces himself had once ravaged with impunity, a land of rough-talking Highland Greeks whom the sophisticated Athenians had long regarded as semi-barbarians themselves. This was the kingdom of Macedon, and in 359 BC it fell into the hands of a man who would, in just 2 decades, rewrite the entire map of the ancient world. Philip II. Philip II was a new kind of king, a figure of terrifying protean genius. He was a ruthless military commander, a master of backroom diplomacy, a charismatic leader, and a patient, long-term strategist. He had spent his youth as a political hostage in the Greek city of Thebes, where he had not languished but learned. He studied the most advanced military tactics of the age, and when he returned to his chaotic, beleaguered kingdom, he brought with him a revolutionary vision. He inherited a second-rate power. He was determined to forge an empire. He began by transforming his army, dispensing with the part-time citizen soldier, and creating a fully professional, state-paid fighting force. He famously lengthened the hoplite spear into the sarissa, a fearsome 18-foot pike, creating the invincible Macedonian phalanx. But his true genius lay in combined arms. He drilled his infantry to work in seamless, lethal concert with his heavy cavalry and a new, sophisticated corps of siege engineers. This new military machine, this professional army, had an insatiable appetite for 2 things: manpower and, above all, gold. And Philip, looking east, knew exactly where to find both. Thrace, with its scattered tribes and its fractured Odrysian leadership, was the perfect, wealthy, and vulnerable target. His interest in Thrace was not casual. It was a core component of his grand strategy. First, and most immediately, he needed the gold and silver mines of the Mount Pangaion region, a rich district on the Thracian coast. Seizing these mines would give him the wealth to pay his soldiers, to build his fleets, and to bribe Greek politicians. Second, he needed to secure his eastern flank. He could not, as he planned his eventual move south to dominate Greece, be worried about the wild Triballi or the other Thracian tribes descending from the Haemus Mountains, as Sitalces had once descended upon his father. Thrace must be neutralized, pacified, and turned into a buffer state. And third, he recognized the value of the Thracians themselves, not as a threat, but as a resource. He coveted their peerless cavalry and their iconic, swift-moving peltasts, seeing them as the perfect, flexible additions to his own heavy infantry phalanx. Philip's subjugation of Thrace was not a single grand campaign like that of Sitalces, but a slow, systematic, and relentless strangulation that lasted for more than 20 years. He was the master of the divide and conquer strategy, a tactic for which the perpetually disunited Thracian tribes were tragically unprepared. He would exploit their ancient rivalries, lending his military support to one Thracian king, like Cersobleptes, the son of the ambitious king Cotys I, only to turn on him later. He used dynastic marriage as a weapon, marrying a Thracian princess, Meta, of the Getae, to secure an alliance in the north, one of several political wives he collected. Where diplomacy and bribery failed, his new, invincible army did the work. He marched, he fought, and he won, pushing his borders steadily east. But Philip's most lasting weapon was not his phalanx. It was his engineers and his architects. He did not just defeat the Thracians. He colonized their lands, planting Macedonian power directly into the soil. In 342 BC, deep in the very heart of the Odrysian plain, on the site of an ancient Thracian settlement by the Hebrus River, he founded a new great city, a fortress, and a regional capital. He named it, with his characteristic lack of modesty, Philippopolis, Philip's city, the magnificent Roman ruins of which now lie beneath the modern Bulgarian city of Plovdiv. This was not a trade outpost. It was a military garrison, a concrete statement of Macedonian domination. Its walls enclosed a strong Macedonian force. Its theaters and temples were designed to project Greek culture, and its strategic position allowed it to control the entire Central Valley, the agricultural and economic heart of Thrace. He founded other similar cities, beacons of Macedonian power in a barbarian land. By 339 BC, the work was largely done. The Odrysian kingdom, which had once terrified Greece, was a broken shell. Its last independent-minded kings, like Cersobleptes, defeated and reduced to vassalage. The rich coastal mines were firmly in Philip's hands, their gold flowing directly into his treasury. The Thracian aristocracy, recognizing the new, unassailable power, had begun to change its allegiance. The Thracian warrior, the peltast, and the horseman was now being recruited, trained, and paid by Macedon. Philip's shadow had indeed fallen across the land, a long, dark shadow of subjugation. He had pacified Thrace, but in doing so, he had also unified it, harnessing its immense martial energy for the first time since Sitalces. But this time, that energy would not be directed by a Thracian king, but by a Macedonian one, and it was about to be unleashed not on Macedon, but on an empire to the east, Persia. In 336 BC, the architect of Macedonian dominance, Philip II, was struck down by an assassin's blade, a sudden, violent end to a reign that had changed the world. His empire, forged through 20 years of war, bribery, and sheer force of will, passed to his son Alexander, a 20-year-old youth of unproven, though terrifying, potential. As is the way of history, the moment the iron grip of the great king was relaxed by death, all the subjugated peoples on the frontiers began to test their new bonds. The Thracian tribes, pacified but never truly broken by Philip, rose in immediate, widespread rebellion, the Triballi and the Getae in the north, seeing a chance to reclaim their hard-won independence. Alexander, before he could ever turn his gaze toward his father's ultimate dream, the invasion of Persia, first had to secure his own backyard. His very first major campaign in the spring of 335 BC was not into Asia, but a lightning-fast, brutal march north, deep into the heart of Thrace. This campaign, though often overshadowed by the later glories of Babylon and Persepolis, was a masterpiece of military genius, a demonstration that the son was perhaps even more formidable than the father. Alexander did not just march to the edge of Thrace, he plunged into its most difficult terrain. He forced the Haemus Mountains in a blinding snowstorm, defeating a Thracian force that had fortified the high passes. He then pursued the formidable Triballi north, smashed their main army, and drove them to a final refuge on an island in the great Danube River. Here, on the very edge of the known world, Alexander did not pause. In a stunning display of logistical audacity, he requisitioned local boats, and even had rafts built from his soldiers' tent hides, and in a single night he crossed the Danube. The Getae, who had massed on the northern bank to intimidate him, were so utterly shocked to see the Macedonian phalanx disembarking on their shore at dawn that their army broke and fled without a single significant fight. Alexander sacked their main town, received tribute from the stunned local tribes, and just as quickly crossed back, his point having been made with terrifying clarity. Thrace was once again under the Macedonian boot. With his northern frontier secured through this calculated campaign of terror, Alexander could finally turn east. But he did not go alone. The Thracian tribes, now thoroughly cowed and bound by treaty, were obligated to provide troops for his grand invasion of the Persian Empire. This is a crucial pivot in their story. From being the target of conquest, they now became the tools of conquest, their legendary martial energy harnessed to an ambition far larger than their own. Throughout Alexander's epic 10-year march from the Aegean to the Indus, Thracian troops were a vital and constant component of his invincible combined arms army. The Macedonian phalanx was the anvil, but the Thracian units were the flexible, deadly hammer. We find them everywhere in the records of his battles. Elite squadrons of Thracian light cavalry, the prodromoi, or lancers, rode on the flanks of the elite Macedonian companion cavalry. They were his scouts, his skirmishers, his fast reaction force, their javelins and speed a perfect counter to the mounted archers of the Persians. At the Battle of Gaugamela, the final decisive confrontation with Darius III, Thracian cavalry were instrumental in protecting the vulnerable left wing of Alexander's line, a desperate, swirling melee that allowed Alexander himself to lead the decisive, wedge-shaped charge into the Persian center. Alongside the horsemen marched thousands of Thracian peltasts, the agile javelin-throwing infantry who could protect the long, exposed flanks of the slow-moving Sarissa phalanx, who could storm broken ground, and who could pursue a fleeing enemy where the heavy infantry could not. They were, in essence, the specialized asymmetrical force that gave the Macedonian army its legendary flexibility. These men, born in the valleys of the Hymus and Rhodope, marched to Babylon, Susa, and into the mountains of modern Afghanistan. Their blood spilled in the service of a Greek king, their wages paid in Persian gold. While his Thracian soldiers marched east, the land of Thrace itself was left behind, a restless and difficult province ruled by a Macedonian viceroy, Antipater. It was a constant source of trouble, with rebellions simmering and tribal kings waiting for any sign of weakness. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC, his empire, lacking a clear heir, was instantly torn apart by his ambitious generals, the Diadochi, or successors. In the great lottery of imperial division, the difficult province of Thrace was awarded to one of the most formidable and perhaps most brutal of Alexander's former bodyguards, Lysimachus. This was not considered a prize. Compared to the civilized ancient wealth of Egypt, which Ptolemy received, or the vast imperial heartland of Asia, which Antigonus seized, Thrace was seen as a cold, poor, and barbarian backwater, a land of endless, thankless border wars. Lysimachus, however, was a man of immense ambition and endurance. He was not content to be a mere governor. He declared himself king of Thrace and set about trying to forge a true, centralized Hellenistic kingdom from this tribal mosaic. For nearly 40 years, his life was one of constant, grinding warfare against the very people he claimed to rule. He fought the Odrysians, he fought the Getae, he fought the coastal Greek cities. He was, in effect, forced to refight the campaigns of both Philip and Alexander, but without their transcendent authority. In one disastrous campaign north of the Danube, he was even defeated and captured by the Gedian king Dromicates. In a famously theatrical display of barbarian magnanimity, Dromicates feasted his royal captive, serving Lysimachus on fine silver and gold plates, while he and his nobles ate from simple wooden trenchers, a powerful sarcastic lesson on the fleeting nature of Macedonian wealth versus the enduring, hard-won liberty of the Getae. Despite these setbacks, Lysimachus endured. Like Philip before him, he founded a new, grand capital city, Lysimachia, built in a commanding position on the Gallipoli Peninsula, a fortress designed to control the vital Hellespont Strait and to project his power. He ruled as a Greek king, minting beautiful coins bearing his own portrait, building temples, and attempting to impose the orderly, bureaucratic structure of a Hellenistic monarchy upon a people who only understood the personal, fluid power of the chieftain. His kingdom was a personal creation, a super-state built on a foundation of resentful vassals and garrisoned forts. He was a Greek king in Thrace, but never a king of the Thracians. His kingdom, which at its height included Macedon and parts of Asia Minor, was a powerful but ultimately hollow entity, and it would not survive his death in battle in 281 BC. His passing would leave yet another power vacuum, but this time it would be a native Thracian king who would rise to fill it. The fall of Lysimachus at the Battle of Corupedium in 281 BC was a seismic event, a sudden shattering of the last great unifying Macedonian power in the region. His Hellenistic kingdom, built on the foundations of Philip's conquests and held together by 40 years of relentless, personal warfare, simply evaporated with its king's final breath. Thrace, which had been a garrisoned, resentful, and restive province, was suddenly left to its own devices, a political void into which no powers would inevitably be drawn. But to truly understand the landscape that Lysimachus left behind, we must understand that Macedonian control had never been as total, as absolute, as the histories written from the victor's perspective might suggest. While Alexander was marching to India, and while Lysimachus was battling for control of an empire, the native Thracian aristocracy was not just a passive, subjugated populace. They were resisting, adapting, and in one extraordinary case, they were building. Our journey, therefore, must take a slight step backward in time to run parallel with the great Macedonian conquerors. We are in the heart of the Odrysian lands, in the central valley that the Bulgarians now call the Valley of the Thracian Rulers, the same region as the painted tomb of Kazanlak. Here, in the final decades of the 4th century BC, while Alexander was in Persia and Lysimachus was consolidating his power, a Thracian king of the old Odrysian line, Suits III, carved out his own defiant path. He was a scion of the great dynasty of Taras and Sitalces, and he refused to accept the role of a simple Macedonian vassal. He was a contemporary of Alexander, and he was a constant, sharp, and painful thorn in the side of the new Hellenistic world order. He led rebellions, fought running battles against Alexander's governors, and even engaged in open war with Lysimachus himself, a conflict he seems to have fought to a draw, securing a hard-won autonomy. But Suits III was not just a mountain rebel, a guerrilla fighter hiding in the passes. He was a politician and a visionary, a man who had learned from his enemies. He saw that the power of the Macedonians lay not just in their phalanx, but in their cities, their centers of administration, economy, and culture. And so, around 325 BC, in a move of profound political audacity, he decided to build his own. On a bend in the Tunja River, he founded a new royal capital, a city he named, in the grand Hellenistic style of his rivals, Suthopolis, the city of sooths. This was not a fortified hilltop settlement of the old Thracian style. This was a polis, a planned city built from scratch, laid out on a Hippodamian grid plan, just like the Greek cities of Asia Minor. It had a strong fortified wall, an agora or central marketplace, temples to the Thracian gods and the Greek gods, and a separate fortified citadel on a hill, which contained the Tirsus, the royal palace. This was a revolutionary act. Sothis was using the very tools of Hellenistic urbanism as an instrument of native resistance. He was declaring, in stone and mortar, that the Odrysians were not barbarians to be ruled from Philippopolis or Lysimachia, but a sovereign kingdom with their own king, their own capital, and their own place in the New World Order. The city was a blend, a perfect symbol of his reign. The language of its administration, as shown by a rare inscription found on the site, was Greek, the lingua franca of the age. But the gods worshipped within its temples were a mixture of Thracian deities and their Greek equivalents. The palace citadel was a Thracian warlord's home, built for a king who feasted his hetairoi, his noble companions, in the old style, but its architecture was modern and defended by advanced fortification techniques. Suthopolis was a bridge between two worlds, a statement that Thracian identity could adapt and modernize without being erased. For decades, Zeus III ruled from this city, a king who had looked the Macedonian storm in the eye and had not blinked. And when he died, around 300 BC, he was buried with a magnificence that encapsulated his entire life. His tomb, the great tumulus at Golyama Kosmatka, is one of the single most astonishing discoveries in Thracian archaeology. From the outside, it is another massive silent hill of earth, but inside, it is a statement of royal power. A long 13-meter stone corridor, a dromos, leads into the earth, opening into a sequence of 3 chambers: a rectangular antechamber, a beautiful high-domed circular tholos chamber with a perfect elegant vault, and finally, a monolithic rectangular burial chamber carved from a single 60-ton block of granite, its entrance sealed with heavy stone doors. The architecture itself, a masterpiece of Hellenistic-inspired stonework, is breathtaking. But it is what was found inside that tells his story. The tomb had been used, archaeologists believe, as a temple for ritual use for some years before the king's final burial. When Zeus died, his body was interred, and his vast personal wealth was placed not in the final chamber, but in the antechambers and the corridor. And what wealth it was! His full set of bronze armor, including a stunning helmet decorated with a wreath, and his greaves, his iron sword with its scabbard adorned in gold, a magnificent, heavy golden wreath of oak leaves, a symbol of royalty, and hundreds of gold and silver objects, including an exquisite golden kylix, a drinking cup, a silver phial, a libation bowl, and other vessels for the eternal feast. Yet, among all this, one object stops the heart. Found ritually buried in front of the tomb's facade, just beyond the entrance, was a life-sized, staggeringly realistic bronze head, a portrait of the king himself. It is, without question, a masterpiece of late classical art. The eyes are inlaid with alabaster and glass, the eyelashes and beard detailed with fine strips of copper. This is not a generic king. This is him. This is South the Third, his face proud, powerful, perhaps a little weary, a Thracian who stared down the greatest generals of his age. It was likely commissioned by the king in his lifetime, perhaps from a Greek master craftsman who had worked in the court of Philip or Alexander. But the spirit it captures is Thracian, a man of power and fierce independence. This bronze face, along with his submerged city and his temple tomb, is the legacy of Sothis III, a Thracian king who refused to be a footnote in another man's history, and who, by adopting the culture of his conquerors, forged a new, powerful, and defiant identity for his own. The world that Sothis III had so defiantly navigated, a world dominated by the great Macedonian successors like Lysimachus, was a world of sharp, clear-cut power. But with the death of Lysimachus in 281 BC and the subsequent slow fading of Sooth's own native dynasty, the entire political structure of the region simply dissolved. The solid ground of empire and kingdom gave way to a power vacuum, a vast, yawning emptiness that pulled at the edges of the known world, and in response, a new storm gathered in the north. This was not a rival Hellenistic king, nor a resurgent Persian army. It was a movement of peoples, a great folk migration of a kind not seen in centuries, a human tempest spilling out of the forests and plains of Central Europe. The Greeks knew them as the Keltoi or the Galatai. The Romans would call them Gauls. We know them as the Celts, and their arrival in the Balkans was an explosion. This was not a unified invasion with a single king, but a series of massive, loosely coordinated migratory waves, entire tribes on the move with their warriors, their families, and their wagons. They were driven by pressures we can only guess at: population growth, climate change, or the simple, restless search for new lands and new plunder. In 279 BC, this great expedition crashed south into the Hellenistic world, which was still reeling from its own internal squabbles. One massive army, led by a chieftain named Bulgios, met and shattered the Macedonian army, killing its king, Ptolemy Karaunos, and leaving Macedon itself in a state of leaderless terror. A second, even more famous host, led by a warrior named Brennus, did the unthinkable. It bypassed the broken Macedonian kingdom and drove deep into the heart of Greece itself, its goal the most sacred, wealthy, and revered sanctuary of the Hellenic world, the oracle of Apollo at Delphi. The sack of Delphi, though perhaps not as total as some accounts claimed, was a profound psychological shock, an act of barbarian sacrilege that echoed from Athens to Alexandria. But this was not the end of the story, for a third contingent of these Gallic invaders, led by a chieftain named Commentorius, had looked at the ravaged landscape of Thrace and saw not a corridor, but a destination. The land of the Odrysians, with its rich river valleys, its long history of gold work, and its now leaderless political structure, was a prize ripe for the taking. The native Thracian tribes, who had so fiercely resisted the organized Macedonian phalanx, were utterly unprepared for the sheer, chaotic ferocity of the Gallic charge. The Celts fought as a wave of individual heroes, their leaders often riding chariots, their warriors, according to some Greek sources, sometimes charging into battle naked, a terrifying psychological display of contempt for their enemies. They swept into the Thracian plains, and the last vestiges of native rule, the proud city of Suthopolis, The very symbol of Soth III's defiance was overrun, sacked, and abandoned during this period of chaos, its walls crumbling, its gridded streets slowly vanishing back into the earth, a poignant, silent end to the dream of an independent Thracian polis. Having broken the back of any organized resistance, Commentorius and his followers did not simply plunder and leave. They stayed. In the heart of eastern Thrace, in a strategic location near the Hymus Mountains, they established a new political entity, a barbarian kingdom of their own, planted firmly on top of the Thracian populace. They founded a new capital, a fortified stronghold named Tylis. This was the birth of the Kingdom of Tylis, a short-lived but profoundly disruptive Celtic state in the middle of Thrace. For the next 70 years, from roughly 279 BC down to 212 BC, the Celts ruled as a foreign military aristocracy, a warrior caste living off the labor and the wealth of the native Thracians. Their kingdom was not a state of administration and architecture. It was a kingdom of the sword, a systematic, organized system of extortion. The model of Tylis was simple: extract tribute. The Gallic kings imposed heavy, crippling taxes on the Thracians in the surrounding territories, but their reach extended even further. The rich, sophisticated Greek merchant cities along the Black Sea coast, which had paid tribute to the Odrysians and maneuvered around the Macedonians, now found a new, more terrifying master. The city of Byzantium, the future Constantinople, was forced to pay an enormous annual tribute in gold to the kings of Tylis, a protection money to prevent the Gallic armies from descending from the hills and sacking their city. This was a predatory state, and it introduced a new cultural layer to the already complex Thracian world. The archaeological record begins to shift. We find Thracian graves from this period that contain weapons and jewelry made not in the old Scythian or Greek-inspired styles, but in the distinctive, swirling, abstract, and organic patterns of the Celtic Latin art style. This was a fusion born of conquest, as Thracian craftsmen adapted their skills to the tastes of their new, foreign masters. This Celtic interlude, however, was built on an unstable foundation of fear and resentment. The Celts of Tylis made no effort to integrate with their Thracian subjects, to build a shared identity, or to rule as anything other than occupiers. They remained an alien, military elite, and their power was only as strong as their last raid. For the Thracians, this period was one of utter chaos, a time when their own political evolution was violently arrested, their old royal lines shattered, and their lands ruled by a new master, as barbarian in their eyes as any other. After nearly 3 generations of this oppressive rule, the simmering Thracian resentment finally boiled over. Around 212 BC, the native tribes, in a rare, coordinated uprising, rose as one. The specific events are lost to history, but the result was total. The Thracians attacked Tylis, overwhelmed its defenders, and destroyed the kingdom. The Greek historian Polybius tells us simply that the kingdom was destroyed by the Thracians, its Celtic populace likely massacred or driven out entirely. The Gallic storm had finally passed, but it left the land in a state of utter political fragmentation, the old Odrysian kingdom a distant memory, the defiant dream of Xuthus a buried ruin. Thrace was now just a mosaic of small, competing chieftains, a land exhausted by successive waves of invasion, unknowingly waiting for the last and most organized shadow to fall upon it from the west. The long, chaotic centuries following the death of Alexander, the reign of Soths, and the violent interlude of the Gallic kings left the Thracian landscape politically shattered. The grand, unified Odrysian kingdom was a memory, and the land was once again a mosaic of competing local chieftains. And yet, beneath the soil, a different kind of history lay waiting, a history that had been sealed in a moment of panic or piety, a history told not in the Greek chronicles of war, but in the silent, breathtaking language of precious metal. The most eloquent, and certainly the most beautiful, testaments to the true wealth and sophisticated spirit of Thrace were not its fleeting kingdoms, but its buried treasures, hoards of gold and silver that by some miracle of chance survived the endless turning of the earth, waiting to be found by men who were not even looking for them. We must go to a small town in central Bulgaria, Panaguriste, not in the ancient past, but in the cold, sharp air of December 8th, 1949. Three brothers, Pavel, Petko, and Mikhail Dakov, are working in a clay pit, digging the raw material for a local brick factory. Their spades strike something hard, something that is not a rock. Brushing away the heavy alluvial clay, they find not a potsherd or a bone, but a piece of solid, gleaming, impossibly heavy gold. They continue to dig, their hands numb with cold and astonishment. What they unearth, piece by piece, is not a few coins or a single piece of jewelry, but a complete, magnificent 9-piece royal banqueting set, a symposium service of a kind never seen before. It consists of a large, heavy phial, a broad, shallow bowl for pouring libations, decorated with concentric rings of acorns, and tiny, exquisitely detailed African heads. There is a grand amphora-shaped rhaeton, or drinking vessel, with 2 dynamic centaurs forming its handles, its body covered in scenes from Greek myth. And then there are the 7 other rida, vessels from which the Thracian lords would drink their wine, each one a masterpiece of sculptural art. 3 of the rida are shaped into the serene, beautiful heads of Amazons, their hair intricately detailed. One is a perfect stag's head, its antlers branching proudly. Another is a ram's head, and 2 more are the 4 parts of centaurs, all rendered with a breathtaking realism. The total weight is over 6 kilograms of 24-karat gold. This is not the delicate, paper-thin gold leaf of a Mycenaean death mask. This is solid, tangible, almost unbelievable wealth. The artistry is a perfect fusion, the central mystery of Thrace itself. The craftsmanship is almost certainly Hellenistic, the work of a master goldsmith in a great Greek colonial center like Lampsacus on the coast of Asia Minor. The style is classical, the mythological scenes are Greek, but the set, the collection of shapes, and the spirit of its use are profoundly, undeniably Thracian. This was not a set for sipping diluted wine in an Athenian andron. This was a ritual set, forged for a Thracian king in the late 4th or early 3rd century BC, the very era of Soths III. It was designed for the great, ecstatic feasts that bound a king to his warrior companions, a holy communion of wine, golds, and divine power, likely in the worship of Dionysus. Then we must travel to another time, another village. It is 1985, in the village of Rogozin in northern Bulgaria. A man, Ivan Dimitrov, is digging an irrigation ditch in his small garden plot. His spade hits a silver jug, and then another, and another. He has not found a set. He has found a hoard. This is the Rogozin treasure, the largest and most significant Thracian treasure ever discovered. It is not the pure, solid gold of Panaguriste, but something almost more personal. A vast collection of 165 pieces, almost entirely of high-quality silver, many of them delicately gilded with gold. There are 108 phiali, 54 jugs, and 3 goblets. This is not a single matching set commissioned at one time. This is a dynastic collection, an accumulation of royal wealth. The styles of the pieces span more than a century, from the classical era of the 5th century BC, the time of Sitalces, down to the late 4th century, the time of Philip's conquest. And here, the metal speaks with a clearer voice. Some of the vessels are inscribed in Greek, the names of their owners scratched into the silver. Cotys, son of Apollon, Cersebleptes, son of Cotys. These are the names of the last great kings of the Odrysians, the very men who fought and failed to stop the rise of Macedon. We see the names of the workshops, the weight of the silver, a royal ledger in metal. The iconography is a perfect window into the Thracian mind. We see the great goddess, Bendis, riding a lioness. We see the sacred stag. We see the Thracian horseman, the divine rider. We see Greek myths like Heracles and Auge, but rendered with a barbarian vitality, a directness and passion that is uniquely Thracian. This was the working, ritual, and diplomatic treasure of the Odrysian royal house, used for generations to feast, to sacrifice, and to give as magnificent gifts to bind vassals to their king. The greatest mystery of these treasures is not who made them, but why they were buried. Neither the Panaguriste nor the Rogozin hoard was found in a tomb. They were not grave goods sent with a king to the afterlife. They were buried in simple pits in the middle of nowhere, wrapped in cloth and hidden in the earth. The Panaguriste set, so perfect and complete, was buried all at once. The Rogozin treasure was buried in 2 separate pits, as if gathered in a hurry. The conclusion is almost inescapable. These are not ritual offerings. These are the emergency hoards of a people in their final, desperate moments of freedom. This is what it looks like when a kingdom collapses. A Thracian king or a high noble, hearing the hoofbeats of the Macedonian phalanx, or the war cries of the Celtic invaders, or the approach of a rival tribe, made a terrible choice. He gathered the sacred dynastic wealth of his ancestors, the very symbols of his power and his connection to the gods, and he buried it, praying he would one day return to reclaim it. He never did. The treasures lay silent in the cold earth, a testament to immense wealth, sophisticated artistry, in a world that was, in the end, consumed by violence, leaving only the glitter of its lost magnificence behind. The chaotic fragmentation of Thrace, which followed the collapse of the kingdom of Tylos, had left the land politically prostrate. The great Odrysian line was a memory, the defiant city of Soothis a buried ruin, and the magnificent golden hoards of kings had been hidden in the earth, never to be reclaimed. This exhaustion, this vacuum of native power, coincided with the rise of a new, methodical, and insatiable power in the West, a shadow that had been creeping across the Adriatic for a century: Rome. The Roman Republic, having conquered Greece and Macedon, now viewed the barbarian lands of Thrace as its new frontier. But its first interactions were not with armies and legions, but with the more insidious arm of its economy: the negotiatores, the merchants, and above all, the slave traders. The constant, low-level tribal warfare that had returned to Thrace made it a perfect tragic hunting ground, a place where captured warriors and their families were rounded up and shipped west to feed the insatiable Roman demand for labor. From this brutal, anonymous trade in human life, one name, one single Thracian, would emerge from the darkness of the chattel pits and be seared into the eternal memory of Rome, a name that would, for a time, become a whisper of pure terror in the marble halls of the Senate. His name was Spartacus. The ancient sources, Plutarch and Appian, who wrote his story long after his death, are hazy on his precise origins, as they were with all men they considered barbarian. They tell us he was a Thracian, born not in the Odrysian plains, but in the highlands, a man of the Haemus mountains, perhaps from the fierce Mighty tribe. They suggest he may have even served as an auxiliary soldier in the Roman army before deserting or being captured, a man who knew his enemies' methods. What is certain is that his Thracian identity was central to his being. Plutarch describes him as a Thracian of nomadic stock, a man possessing not only great courage and strength, but also in sagacity and culture superior to his fortune. A subtle and somewhat surprised Roman admission of his quality. This free man of the mountains, by whatever cruel twist of fate, was captured, sold, and transported to the heart of Roman Italy. He was destined for the arena, the ultimate expression of Roman power over the conquered. He was sent to the ludus, the gladiator school, of Lentulus Batiatus in the city of Capua, a wealthy, sun-drenched town that was the center of the gladiator industry. We must imagine him there, this Thracian, a man born to the open, wind-swept hills, now living in a stone cell, breathing the dust of the training yard, the air thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and blood. He was being trained as a murmillo, or perhaps even a Thrax, a gladiator type ironically named for his people, forced to fight in a stylized, barbarian costume for the entertainment of his masters. It was here, in this crucible of humiliation and violence, that the spark of his Thracian spirit, the spirit of the Peltast and the mountain warrior, refused to be extinguished. In 73 BC, Spartacus and a small group of his fellow gladiators, mostly Gauls and Germans, decided on a desperate act. Their plot was discovered, but they improvised, seizing not weapons, but kitchen knives, cleavers, and roasting spits. In a chaotic, bloody brawl, some 70 gladiators, led by Spartacus and the Gallic chieftain Crixus, fought their way out of the school, out of the city of Capua, and into the open countryside. It was a suicidal, hopeless gesture, the kind of minor slave outbreak that Roman garrisons were used to crushing. The fugitives fled to the most logical place for a desperate man. High ground. They established a makeshift stronghold on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, a quiet, vine-covered volcano that had not yet revealed its terrible, fiery nature. It was here, on the slopes of Vesuvius, that Spartacus gave the Romans their first, stunning lesson in Thracian tactics. The Roman praetor, Clodius Glaber, arrived from Rome with a militia of 3,000 men, not legions, but a force more than capable of starving out 70 gladiators. Glaber did not bother with an assault. He simply blocked the one known path up the mountain and waited. He had trapped them. This was a problem for a Roman general, but not for a Thracian. Spartacus, looking at the sheer, impassable cliffs on the other side of the mountain, saw not a wall, but a tool. He saw the wild vines that clung to the rock face. In an act of pure, asymmetrical genius, he and his men harvested the vines, twisted them into long, sturdy ladders, and in the dead of night descended the cliffs in total silence. They fell upon the Roman camp from the rear, a place where no attack was thought possible. Glaber's force, caught completely by surprise, was not defeated. It was annihilated. This victory was the spark that lit the inferno. The news, carried by word of mouth, traveled faster than any legion. Slaves from the vast agricultural estates of Campania, the latifundia, began to flee their masters, flocking to Spartacus's banner. His small band of 70 became an army of thousands, then tens of thousands. He was no longer a gladiator. He was a general, and he began to apply the military principles of his homeland. He did not try to build a phalanx. He built a fast-moving, fluid army. He avoided pitched battles on the plains, where the heavy Roman legion was invincible. Instead, he chose the terrain. He fought in the hills, the forests, and the broken ground of the Apennines, the very kind of landscape his Thracian ancestors had mastered. He taught his men, this desperate mob of agricultural slaves and foreign captives, the tactics of the peltest, the ambush, the lightning-fast raid, the feigned retreat, the attack on the supply line. He defeated 2 more Roman forces, and then, in 72 BC, in a year of terrifying success, he met and defeated both Roman consular armies, the full professional legions of the Republic, sent to destroy him. Spartacus, the Thracian slave, now commanded an army of perhaps 70,000, and he was the master of Italy. The Senate in Rome was gripped by a panic it had not known since Hannibal. This was no longer a bellum servile, a servile war. This was an existential threat. The motives of Spartacus himself remain a mystery, his voice forever silenced, his story told only by his conquerors. Did he intend to march on Rome itself? Or was he trying, as Plutarch suggests, to lead his people north, over the Alps, to escape Italy and find freedom in their respective homelands? We will never know. But his success could not last. The full, systematic, and ruthless power of the Republic was finally brought to bear, not by a politician, but by the wealthiest and perhaps most cruel man in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus, taking command of 8 legions, did not underestimate his foe. He was a methodical and brutal commander. He cornered Spartacus in the toe of Italy, and when Spartacus looked for escape, Crassus did the unthinkable. He built a wall, a line of fortification 37 miles long, across the entire peninsula, trapping the slave army. After several desperate, failed attempts to break out, Spartacus was finally forced to do the one thing he had always avoided: fight a pitched, decisive battle against the legions on open ground. The final battle, in 71 BC, was an act of terrible foregone slaughter. Spartacus, knowing the end had come, fought in the old heroic Thracian style. Plutarch says he tried to cut his way through the ranks directly to Crassus himself, a chieftain seeking his rival. He was cut down, his body so hacked to pieces by the Romans that it could not be identified. His army was destroyed. Crassus, in a final terrifying message to the world, crucified the 6,000 survivors along the entire length of the Via Appia, the road from Capua to Rome, a silent, agonizing forest of crosses that stood for months. Spartacus, the Thracian, was gone, but he had proven that a single man, armed with the tactical ingenuity of his barbarian homeland, could take the refuse of the Roman system and forge it into an army that brought the Republic to its very knees. The terrifying, tragic blaze of Spartacus's rebellion, though it shook Rome to its core, was not the cause of Rome's advance into Thrace. It was a symptom of a process already well underway. The Thracian heartland, by the time Spartacus was captured and sold, was already a fractured frontier, a land hemorrhaging its own people into the Roman slave markets. The true systematic absorption of Thrace was a far slower, colder, and more methodical affair, a story not of a single slave general, but of a century-long glacial advance of legions, governors, and tax collectors. It began, as Roman conquests often did, almost by accident, a consequence of victory elsewhere. In 168 BC, at the Battle of Pydna, Rome had shattered the Macedonian phalanx, and by 146 BC, with the destruction of Corinth, both Macedon and Greece were reduced to Roman provinces. Suddenly, the Roman Republic found itself sharing a long, undefined, and deeply unstable border with the Thracian tribes. Rome's initial policy was not one of immediate, direct conquest. Thrace, to the pragmatic mind of the Senate, was a complex, mountainous, and unruly land, expensive to garrison and difficult to tax. It was far simpler to let the barbarians manage themselves, to let their own internal conflicts serve as a check on their power. The strategy was to create a buffer zone, a network of reges, socii et amici, allied kings and friends of the Roman people. The remnants of the old Thracian dynasties, particularly the Sapaean tribe in the south, were formally recognized, flattered with Roman titles, and given the task of keeping the peace, which in Roman terms meant ensuring the more warlike tribes of the interior, especially the Bessi and the Triballi, did not raid south into the wealthy taxable province of Macedon. This was a classic Roman strategy, outsourcing frontier defense to a loyal local puppet, a client king who owed his throne and his power to the shadow of the legions. For nearly 100 years, this fragile system held, but it was a period of constant, low-intensity warfare. The Roman governors of Macedon, ambitious men looking to win a triumph, to advance their political careers, found a convenient and perpetual excuse for war just across their northern border. A Thracian raid, real or fabricated, was all the justification needed to lead 1 or 2 legions north on a punitive expedition. These campaigns were a slow, grinding process of attrition. Each incursion pushed the limes, the effective Roman frontier, a little further north, a little deeper into the Thracian heartland. We read of governors like Marcus Didius, who in 103 BC battled the Scordici, a mixed Celtic Thracian people, and Gaius Scribonius Curio, who in 75 BC campaigned all the way to the Danube, the first Roman general to ever see the great river. Each campaign left behind a chain of small forts, new military roads, and a new set of cowed, tribute-paying tribes. The most formidable resistance, as always, came from the mountains. The Bessi, the fierce guardians of the Dionysian oracle, refused to bend. Their priest kings, ruling from the high Rhodops, saw the Romans as just another, more organized invader, no different from the Macedonians. They became the symbolic and practical center of anti-Roman resistance. This stubborn independence finally drew the full, methodical wrath of Rome. Around 29 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the grandson of the man who defeated Spartacus, was given the proconsulship of Macedon. He was a man of his grandfather's ambition, and he used a Basternai raid as a pretext for a massive, multi-year campaign to subdue the entire Thracian peninsula. He marched north, shattered the Bessi, and in a move of profound symbolic power, he seized their ancient sanctuary of Dionysus. He ripped the sacred oracle from the control of the Bessi priests, who had guarded it for 1,000 years, and gave it, as a reward for loyalty, to the rival and thoroughly Romanized kings of the Sapian dynasty. It was a calculated act of sacrilege, a demonstration that even the Thracian gods were now subject to Roman political will. This act effectively broke the back of organized Thracian resistance. The last shreds of true independence were gone, replaced by a single, dominant client kingdom, that of the Sapians, ruled by kings who often held Roman citizenship and wore Roman togas. The greatest of these was Rhoemetalces the First, a man who had fought with Augustus's generals during the civil wars and was rewarded with a vast, consolidated Thracian kingdom. But he was a king in name only. He was an agent of the empire, his power guaranteed by the legions on his border. His dynasty, predictably, was plagued by the very instability it was meant to control. Pro-Roman and anti-Roman factions within the nobility, dynastic murders, and popular uprisings against his Roman rule. This constant simmering unrest, this endless messy management of a free Thrace, finally wore out the patience of the emperors. The end came not with a bang, but with a sordid domestic crime that served as a final pretext. In 46 AD, the last client king, Rhoemetalces III, was murdered by his own wife, Pythodorus II, an act that plunged the kingdom into its final, chaotic succession crisis. The Emperor Claudius, a man known for his bureaucratic and administrative mind, decided that the century-long experiment in indirect rule had failed. It was time to absorb the land completely, to bring it fully into the Pax Romana. He dispatched the governor of Moesia, and the last brief flares of Thracian rebellion were extinguished by the legions. The kingdom was dissolved. The land of Orpheus, of Sitalsis, of Soths was formally annexed. It was reorganized, surveyed, and taxed as the new imperial province of Thracia. The old tribal names were erased, the old boundaries redrawn, and the long, slow, brutal absorption was complete. The Thracians, who had for so long defined themselves by their fragmentation and fierce independence, were now at last united, not by a king of their own, but as subjects of a distant Caesar. The final chaotic murder of the last Sapian king and the quiet bureaucratic decree of the Emperor Claudius in 46 AD marked the end of Thracian political history. The land of Sitalces, Sothis, and Spartacus, a place that had defined itself for a millennium through its fierce, fragmented independence, was now simply Thracia, an imperial province, a new line item on the vast, orderly ledger of the Roman Empire. But the Roman genius was not just for conquest, it was for integration. The legions that had secured the land were now followed by the surveyors, the engineers, the architects, and the tax collectors, and their work would transform the Thracian landscape more profoundly and permanently than any war. The wild, mountainous, and rural world of the tribal chieftains was about to be systematically paved over, replotted, and rebuilt in the unmistakable image of Rome. The primary instrument of this transformation was the city. The Thracians, even at the height of the Odrysian kingdom, were a people of fortified hilltop residences, small settlements, and scattered agricultural villages. Their power was in the land, the forests, and the mountains. Roman power, by contrast, resided in the civitas, the city, a self-governing, stone-built center of administration, commerce, law, and above all, culture. Rome did not just occupy Thrace, it began to build it anew, planting these urban centers like anchors of Roman identity deep in the native soil. The old Macedonian foundation of Philippopolis, Philip's city, was the first and greatest to be transformed. It was elevated to the status of a metropolis, the capital of the new province. The old chaotic settlement was razed and rebuilt on a grand imperial scale. A sprawling marble-paved forum was laid out, the heart of political and commercial life, surrounded by temples, a library, and a treasury. An aqueduct system brought fresh mountain water to its citizens. A magnificent semicircular theater, a masterpiece of Roman engineering, was built into the side of one of its hills, where the new, Romanized Thracian elite could watch the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides. And most tellingly, a vast 30,000-seat stadium was constructed, a place for the chariot races and gladiatorial games that were the hallmark of the Pax Romana. This was not the only new star in the urban constellation. On the site of an ancient Thracian settlement, the Romans founded Serdica, the city that would one day become Sofia, the capital of modern Bulgaria. Its location was not random. It sat at the nexus of the most important new strategic artery in the Balkans, the Great Via Militaris, or Via Diagonalis. This was more than a road. It was the spine of Roman power, a broad, paved all-weather highway that sliced diagonally across the peninsula, connecting the Danube frontier at Singadunum, Belgrade, all the way to Byzantium, the city that would one day become Constantinople. Serdica and Philippopolis were the great fortified waypoints on this military corridor, allowing legions to march from the European frontier to the Asian border at a speed that was previously unimaginable. Alongside these, other cities, like Augusta Traiana, founded by the Emperor Trajan, sprang up, each a miniature Rome, with its grid-planned streets, its public baths, its temples, and its local senate, all designed to project the power and the permanence of the empire. This new, urbanized world fundamentally rewired the Thracian soul. The old aristocracy, the families of the warrior chieftains, faced a simple choice. They could retreat to their crumbling hill forts and become irrelevant, impoverished relics, or they could join. Overwhelmingly, they chose to join. They moved down from the hills and into the plains. They shed their old identities, learned Latin and Greek, and built magnificent Roman-style villae rusticae, sprawling agricultural estates from which they managed the vast grain and timber resources of their ancestral lands. They took Roman names, wore the toga, and vied for the prestige of becoming a local magistrate, a priest of the imperial cult, or the sponsor, editor, of a lavish gladiatorial game in the new stadium at Philippopolis. Their sons, in turn, no longer proved their manhood by raiding their neighbors, but by joining the Roman army. The Thracian warrior, the wild peltast, and the superb horseman was not eliminated. He was professionalized. The province of Thracia became one of the single most important recruiting grounds for the entire Roman military, particularly for its auxiliary cohorts. A young Thracian would enlist for a 25-year term, and he would be sent to the farthest corners of the empire, to the cold, wet frontier of Hadrian's Wall in Britain, to the dry, dusty limes of Syria, or to the deserts of North Africa. There, he would fight for Rome, learn Latin, and live as a Roman soldier. At the end of his long service, he would be granted the ultimate prize, full Roman citizenship for himself and his descendants. He would then retire, perhaps in the land where he served, or perhaps back in Thracia, but he would return as Civis Romanus, a Roman citizen, his identity, and that of his family forever changed. This was the brilliant, inexorable engine of assimilation, the very quality that had defined Thracian barbarism. Their martial prowess was now the primary vehicle for their Romanization. The Thracian language, which had never been written, began its long, slow fade, retreating to the high mountain villages, replaced in all public and commercial life by the Latin of the army and the Greek of the educated elite. The transformation was so total that within a few generations, the Thracians, once the most numerous people after the Indians, were on their way to becoming simply Romans. The slow, steady, and inexorable process of Romanization, which we have just witnessed, was a story defined by a boundary. That boundary was the great river Ister, the mighty Danube. South of its broad flowing current, in the new provinces of Thracia and Moesia, the old tribal world was being systematically paved over with Roman roads, replotted into Roman cities, and its people integrated into the Roman military and economy. But to the north of that river, a very different story was unfolding. The Danube, for centuries, was not just a geographical feature, it was the limes, the hard frontier of the empire, and beyond it, the Thracian-speaking peoples of the north. The Getae and their close kin, the Dacians, continued to forge their own distinct and fiercely independent cultural path. Our focus, therefore, must shift away from the Romanized plains of Bulgaria and into the vast, rugged landscape of what is today Romania. This was the homeland of the Getae and Dacians, a territory of two distinct halves. To the south lay the fertile Wallachian plain, a sprawling flatland that was, like the steppes to its east, a natural highway for horse-riding nomads. But the true heart of this land, its fortress and its treasury, was the great, curving bastion of the Carpathian Mountains. This was a land of dense, primeval forests, of high, easily defensible valleys, and, most critically, of immense, sun-tapped mineral wealth. The mountains of Transylvania were rich in iron, in silver, and most tempting of all, in gold, a fact that had not escaped the notice of their neighbors. These northern Thracians, whom we shall begin to call Dacians as their name becomes more prominent, had always been on a different trajectory from their southern cousins. Their neighbors were not just the Greeks on the Aegean coast. To their east were the Scythians and later the Sarmatians, nomadic horse archers from whom they learned new styles of warfare, art, and adornment. To their west, the Celtic migrations that had briefly founded the kingdom of Tylus had also washed against the Carpathians, introducing new metalworking techniques and Latin artistic motifs. The Dacians, therefore, were a fusion culture, their Thracian core, their language, their religious beliefs, like the cult of the immortality god Zalmoxis, was overlaid with a hard, practical veneer of Celtic and Scythian influence. They were masters of the horse, skilled in both the javelin of their ancestors and the curved blade of the steppes. While the Odrysian kingdom to the south had risen, peaked, and been shattered by Macedon and the Gauls, the Dacians had remained in their fragmented tribal state. They lived in small compita, or villages, and their power was concentrated in the hands of local chieftains who ruled from fortified hilltop settlements known as Davae. These Davae, names like Argidava, Petrodava, and the future capital, Sarmizegethusa, were the centers of local power, high places of refuge and authority, not unlike the hill forts of the Bessi, but on a grander, more formidable scale. For centuries, these tribes had fought each other, allied with the Scythians, and raided south across the Danube, remaining a persistent barbarian thorn in the side of whoever ruled Macedon and Thrace. The arrival of the Romans on the Danube's southern bank in the 1st century BC did not cow them. It galvanized them. While the southern Thracians were being slowly, methodically absorbed, the Dacians were watching, learning, and hardening. The Roman presence across the river provided a new, singular, and existential threat, a common enemy that began to override, for the first time, their ancient, ingrained tribal rivalries. They saw what had happened to the Sapaeans, the Bessi, and the Odrysians, a slow death by assimilation. The Dacians, protected by the great river and their mountain fortress, chose a different path. They began to see the raids of their neighbors not just as a nuisance, but as an opportunity, and the new Roman province of Moesia as a rich, tempting target. This was the crucial difference. The Romanization of Thracia was the story of an ending, the absorption of a once great people into a larger whole. The contemporary history of Dacia, on the other hand, was the story of a beginning. This was not a culture in decline. It was a culture in its heroic age, a people on the cusp of unification. The constant, low-level warfare against Roman patrols, the shared threat of the legions, and the immense wealth that could be gained from raiding Roman supply lines, all created the perfect conditions for a great leader to emerge. The fragmented Dacian tribes, for all their fierce independence, were beginning to feel the pull of a shared destiny, a need for a single, powerful hand to unite their davos, to harness their martial energy, and to forge their disparate mountain strongholds into a single, terrifying barbarian empire, an empire that would not just resist Rome, but one that would dare, for a brief, spectacular moment, to rival it. The fragmented, warlike world of the Dacian tribes, a society of competing Devae and mountain chieftains, was a tinderbox awaiting a spark. It had the manpower, the wealth from its gold mines, and a unifying external enemy in the form of Rome, which was now firmly entrenched on the southern bank of the Danube. All that was missing was a leader, a figure with the military prowess, the political vision, and the sheer ruthlessness to bind these disparate, fiercely independent tribes into a single, cohesive force. In the middle of the 1st century BC, precisely such a man emerged from the Dacian heartland, a leader whose name would soon be spoken with a mixture of fear and respect in the Roman Senate itself. His name was Burebista. Burebista's origins, like those of so many barbarian kings, are shrouded in mystery. He was not a creature of Roman record, but a force of nature that burst from the Carpathian forests, seemingly fully formed. He steps onto the stage of history around 82 BC, not as a king, but as a paramount chieftain, a hegemon who, through a combination of personal charisma, battlefield victories, and brutal, calculated diplomacy, began the long and arduous task of forging a nation. He did not just ask for allegiance, he demanded it, and he had the power to enforce his will. But Burebista's genius was not purely military. He understood that an empire built on fear alone is brittle. He needed a deeper, more profound source of unity, a spiritual and moral authority that could transcend the ancient blood feuds of the clans. He found this authority in a remarkable partnership, an alliance that would define his reign. This partner was a man named Decaneus, a high priest, a pontifex of the Zalmoxian cult. Decaneus was no simple mountain shaman. The Greek sources, like Strabo, describe him as an ascetic, a philosopher, and a man of immense learning who had perhaps traveled to Egypt and returned with knowledge of astronomy, physics, and natural law. He was a moral and spiritual reformer. Burebista, the warrior king, forged a powerful alliance with this high priest. It was a perfect fusion of temporal and spiritual power. Burebista provided the muscle, the iron will to unify the tribes, while Decaneus provided the soul. He proclaimed Burebista as the chosen agent of the gods. He traveled with the king, preaching a reformed, more austere version of the old Thracian religion. He instituted a new moral code, a set of laws, and in a famously pragmatic move, he is said to have convinced the tribes to cut down all their grapevines and give up drinking wine, a measure to instill discipline and end the drunken feuds that had always undermined Dacian unity. This moral rearmament, combined with Burebista's military genius, was devastatingly effective. One by one, the other Dacian and Gedian chieftains were brought into the fold. Those who resisted were crushed. Those who joined were rewarded. Within a few short years, Burebista was not just a hegemon. He was the undisputed king, the Rex, of a vast unified Dacian-Gedian empire. This was not a loose confederation like the Odrysian kingdom of old. It was a centralized, theocratic, and militaristic state, its capital established at the great mountain fortress of Sarmizegethusa Regia, a remote, high-altitude sanctuary in the Orestian Mountains, a place that was both a royal residence and the sacred center of the Zalmoxian cult. Once his home was in order, Burebista turned his gaze outward. His new, disciplined army, which sources claim could number as many as 200,000 men, another vast, terrifying exaggeration that nonetheless speaks to his power, was unleashed on his neighbors. He did not just raid, he conquered. He swept west, shattering the Celtic tribes of the Boii and Taurishi, extending his domain into modern-day Slovakia. He marched east, all the way to the Black Sea, and in a campaign of stunning audacity, he systematically besieged and conquered every single wealthy Greek colonial city on the coast, from Olbia in the north down to Apollonia in the south. These cities, which had maintained their independence for centuries, were now vassals of a Dacian king, forced to pay him tribute. At its absolute zenith, Burebista's empire was a colossal entity, stretching from the Pannonian Basin to the Black Sea, from the Carpathian forests down to the Roman border on the Danube. And it was this border that now defined the world. In the 40s BC, the Roman Republic was not a distant rumor. It was the neighboring superpower, and it was in the throes of its own violent death, the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. Burebista, the master of this new northern empire, was not a passive observer. He was a player. He saw the Roman chaos as an opportunity. He chose a side, aligning himself with Pompey, the traditionalist, aristocratic faction of the Senate. He was no fool. He saw Caesar as the more aggressive, expansionist, and dangerous of the two, the one whose ambitions would inevitably lead north. It was a calculated, strategic gamble, and in 48 BC, he sent ambassadors and likely auxiliary troops to aid Pompey's cause. It was a gamble he lost. At the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar's legions shattered Pompey's army, and Pompey himself fled to Egypt, where he was murdered. Julius Caesar was now the undisputed and famously unforgiving master of the Roman world, and he had a very long memory. Burebista's Dacian Empire, this massive, newly forged barbarian state that had dared to intervene in a Roman civil war, was now at the very top of Caesar's to-do list. In 44 BC, back in Rome, Caesar, now dictator for life, began preparations for what was to be his next great military campaign, his masterpiece of conquest that would, he believed, surpass even his subjugation of Gaul. He assembled 16 legions and a vast force of cavalry. The target was not Parthia, his great rival in the east, not yet. The first target was Dacia. He was going to march north, cross the Danube, and dismantle Burebista's empire piece by piece. The two greatest, most ambitious autocrats of the age, Burebista the Dacian king and Caesar the Roman dictator, were on a collision course, set for a war that would have reshaped the future of Europe. The world held its breath, waiting for the clash of these two titans, a clash of the new Roman order and the last great Thracian empire. And then, in a single, shocking historical instant, it was all over. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated on the floor of the Roman Senate, his body pierced by the daggers of his own colleagues. And in that very same year, perhaps only months later, in a stunning coincidence, a conspiracy of Dacian nobles, chafing under his iron-fisted centralized rule and his religiously mandated austerity, rose up against Burebista and assassinated him. Both great empires, the one ascendant, the one newly born, were decapitated in the same year, their fates inextricably and fatally linked. With Burebista's death, his empire, built so quickly and held together entirely by his personal will and his alliance with Decianus, shattered just as quickly, its unity vanishing, its vast territories splintering back into the hands of local chieftains, the great Dacian state dissolving like a dream at dawn. The twin assassinations of 44 BC, which had simultaneously decapitated the new Dacian Empire and the Roman Republic, created a century-long pause in the great confrontation on the Danube. Burebista's vast, centralized kingdom, held together by his personal will and the spiritual authority of his high priest, shattered almost overnight, its constituent tribes and chieftains reverting to their old, fragmented state. Rome, meanwhile, plunged into the final agonizing death throes of its republic, the civil wars of Octavian and Antony, which would give way to the cautious, stabilizing consolidation of the new Augustan peace. For 100 years, the Danube frontier was a place of low-intensity conflict, not of grand strategy. The Dacian tribes, leaderless and disunited, were a nuisance, a source of seasonal raids into the new, heavily fortified Roman province of Moesia on the river's southern bank, but they were not an existential threat. The Romans, for their part, were content to let them squabble, launching punitive raids when necessary, but lacking the political will for a full-scale, costly conquest of the Carpathian fortress. This long, simmering stalemate was broken in the latter half of the 1st century AD, when a new, formidable leader arose among the Dacians. He was not a spiritual revolutionary like Burebista. He was a hardened, pragmatic, and intensely cunning wartime king, a man who had not just fought the Romans, but had studied them. His name was Decebalus, and he was the political and military heir to the dream of a unified Dacian state. He reforged the kingdom not as a sprawling multi-ethnic empire, but as a tight, militarized, and heavily fortified mountain bastion, its capital once again in the high, sacred precincts of the Orestiae Mountains at Sarmizegetusa, Regia. Decebalus was a master of engineering and a patient strategist. He began a massive public works project, strengthening the Murus Daciacus, the Dacian Wall, a unique, sophisticated system of ramparts that used timber beams to internally brace the stone, creating a flexible and incredibly durable defense against Roman siege engines. His power and his audacity grew. This new, aggressive Dacian kingdom could not be ignored. In 86 AD, Decebalus led a massive raid south across the Danube, shattering the Roman legions stationed in Moesia and killing the governor himself. The Emperor Domitian, a vain and authoritarian ruler, was forced to respond. He sent his praetorian prefect, Cornelius Fuscus, with a massive army to invade Dacia and punish the king. Decebalus, fighting on his home turf, simply retreated, luring the Roman army deep into the mountains, into a narrow forested pass known as Tapai, the Iron Gate of Transylvania. There he sprang a perfect, devastating ambush. The Roman army was mauled, Fuscus was killed, and in the ultimate unforgivable humiliation, the army's sacred Aquila, the silver eagle of the legion, likely the Val Alaude, was captured. Domitian, facing a military disaster and simultaneous trouble on the Rhine frontier, was forced into a deeply shameful peace. In 89 AD, a treaty was signed. Decebalus, the man who had defeated a Roman army and captured its eagle, was officially named a client king. But in reality, Rome was forced to pay him a massive annual subsidy in gold and silver, and most incredibly, to send him its own military engineers, catapult builders, and siege craftsmen, who Decebalus then used to make his mountain fortresses even more impregnable. For over a decade, Rome paid protection money to a barbarian king who was using Roman technology to prepare for his next war against Rome. This was the situation, an unhealed, festering wound on the empire's honor that was inherited in 98 AD by a new emperor, a man of a very different character, Marcus Ulpius Traianus, or Trajan. Trajan was not a palace politician from Rome. He was a career soldier from Spain, a disciplined, non-nonsense, and universally respected general. He understood that the Dacian problem was not just an embarrassment, but a grave strategic threat. He would not abide a subsidized, armed, and arrogant barbarian kingdom on his frontier, one that held a lost Roman eagle. He spent 3 years meticulously preparing his campaign, amassing over 10 legions, and in 101 AD, he launched the First Dacian War. He did not rush in like Fuscus. He built a massive pontoon bridge over the Danube and advanced slowly, methodically. He met Decebalus at the same pass, Tapae, but this time, after a long, bloody, and difficult battle, the disciplined Roman legions won the day. Trajan's forces ground their way through the Dacian fortress network, and by 102 AD, Decebalus, cornered and facing annihilation, sued for peace. The terms were harsh. He was to tear down all his walls, surrender all his Roman engineers, and become a true vassal. But Decebalus was a Thracian king, and his spirit was not broken. He immediately, and in secret, began to rebuild his forts, rearm his people, and attack Roman allies. In 105 AD, Trajan, his patience exhausted, declared a second final war. This would not be a war of pacification, it would be a war of annihilation. Trajan commissioned his master architect, Apollodorus of Damascus, to build a permanent bridge across the Danube at Drobeta, a marvel of stone piers and timber arches over 1,000 meters long. This bridge was a statement in stone. Rome was not visiting, it was moving in. The legions poured across, and this time the war was a slow, systematic, and brutal siege of the entire Dacian mountain kingdom. Roman engineers built roads, forts, and siege ramps, strangling the Dacian Davae one by one. The final siege was at the capital, Sarmizegetusa Regia. After a long, desperate defense, the Romans found and cut the city's hidden water supply. The city fell. The Dacian nobles, seeing the end, gathered in the main hall and in a final tragic act of mass defiance, drank poison, choosing suicide over slavery. Decebalus himself, with a few loyal cavalrymen, escaped the burning capital, but he was relentlessly hunted by Roman patrols. The end is famously and poignantly depicted in stone. Cornered by Roman cavalry, his last companions dead, the king sat down beneath a tree, and as the Roman soldiers closed in to take him alive, he raised his own falx, the curved Dacian sword, and cut his own throat. His head was brought to Trajan. The war was over. Dacia, its fighting-age population, largely exterminated or enslaved, was annexed as a new Roman province. The spoils of war, including Decebalus's vast royal treasury hidden in a riverbed, were so immense that Trajan was able to fund a 12-day, 10,000 gladiator celebration in Rome, and to give every Roman citizen a cash bonus. To commemorate this final epic war, he built the magnificent Trajan's Forum, and in its center, a 126-foot-tall column, which still stands today. In a single, continuous, 660-foot-long spiral frieze, it tells the entire brutal and heroic story of the Dacian Wars, a final Roman-written epitaph for the last and greatest of the free Thracian kingdoms. The final, brutal, and heroic conquest of Dacia, immortalized on the spiraling column of Trajan, and the earlier, quieter, bureaucratic absorption of the province of Thracia, marked the definitive end of the Thracians as a free political people. Their last great king was dead, his head carried on a Roman pike. Their mountain capital was a smoking ruin, soon to be replaced by a Roman colonia bearing Trajan's family name, Ulpia Traiana Sarmizegetusa, planted on the open plain miles away from the sacred highlands. South of the Danube, their aristocracy was already building Roman-style villas. Their sons were taking Roman names, and their native language, never written, had begun its long, slow retreat into the hills, a whisper on the verge of silence. It would be easy to close the book here, to assume that the deep, unique, and passionate spirit of the Thracian world was simply extinguished, paved over by the Via Militaris, and replaced by the Latin of the Legion and the Greek of the Agora. But a culture, a way of seeing the world, is not a kingdom. It cannot be decapitated by a single sword stroke or dissolved by a single imperial decree. It is a living thing, and like a powerful river forced underground, it will find new, unexpected channels to the surface. And as the Roman peace, the Pax Romana, settled over the Balkan provinces, the old, untamed Thracian soul did just that. It reemerged, not in a great, heroic rebellion, but in a quiet, personal, and profoundly mysterious act of devotion, an artifact that would become the single most common and most enduring piece of evidence for their entire civilization. It is not a treasure of gold, nor a king's tomb, but a small, humble, carved stone plaque, the votive relief of the Thracian horsemen. Across the entire expanse of the former Thracian lands, from the mountains of Dacia through the plains of Moesia and deep into the heart of Roman Thracia, archaeologists have unearthed more than 2,500 of these reliefs. They are not grand imperial monuments. They are small, personal stelae, the kind a single family or a humble devotee would commission from a local stonemason and set up in a small, rural shrine, at a sacred spring, or within their own home. Their uniformity, despite the vast distances and the centuries of their production, primarily from the 2nd to the 4th centuries AD, is astonishing. They are a single, powerful idea, a shared icon for a people who no longer had a shared king. The iconography is remarkably consistent, a silent, sacred story told in stone. We see a male figure, the horseman, always on a horse shown in profile, moving almost without exception from left to right. He is a hunter. His arm is raised, holding a spear poised to strike an animal at his horse's feet. This animal is most often a wild boar, a beast of the deep forest, a symbol of both chaos and sacred power. The rider himself is depicted in a heroic, syncretic blend of styles. He wears the chlamys, the short, flowing cloak of a Greek hero, which billows out behind him, giving a sense of divine forward motion. His horse is powerful, almost unnaturally spirited, its head often turned toward its master. A hunting dog almost always accompanies him, leaping forward at the boar, a faithful companion in this mythic hunt. But it is the other, quieter elements that deepen the mystery. Often, there is a tree in the scene, a central sacred tree around which a snake is coiled, its head pointed toward the rider. The snake, in the ancient Mediterranean world, is a powerful and ambiguous symbol. It is a creature of the earth, a chthonic spirit, a guardian of sacred places, a symbol of healing, and a representation of the dead. In some of the more elaborate reliefs, a female figure, a goddess or a priestess, stands by the tree, sometimes offering the horseman a patera, a libation bowl, welcoming him or sanctifying his act. The entire scene is one of ritual, not just a simple depiction of a hunt. It is a sacred moment, frozen in time. The central, tantalizing mystery is, simply, who is he? The stelae themselves are often inscribed, but they do not give one clear answer. The inscriptions are almost always in Greek or Latin, the languages of the New Order. Many are dedicated to heroes, or heron, the Greek word for hero, but used here in a divine sense, a hero god. Others are dedicated to the Roman god of the woods, Sylvanus, or the Greek god of healing, Asclepius. Some are even dedicated, in a great leap of syncretism, to Hieros Apollon. This fusion is the key. The Thracian horseman is not a single, forgotten god with a lost Thracian name. He is instead the ultimate expression of the Romanized Thracian male deity. He is the heir to all the old gods of the wild, the mountain and the forest, a divine daemon who, under the Roman gaze, has put on the costume of a classical hero. What, then, does the image mean? To the Thracian who commissioned it, it likely held several layers of truth at once. On one level, he is the divine hunter, the kinegetikos, the master of the wild, a god who protects the flocks, grants success in the hunt, and controls the untamed forces of nature. On another, more profound level, the iconography of the snake, the tree, and the hunt for the chthonic boar suggests he is a god of life, death, and rebirth. He is a psychopomp, a guide for souls, a figure who, like his distant cousin Orpheus, can ride between this world and the next. The hunt is not just for a boar, it is a ritualized triumph over death, the snake-entwined tree, a symbol of the world's axis, the connection point between the earth and the heavens. But there is a third, more personal interpretation that is just as compelling. The horseman may not be the god at all, but the worshipper himself, depicted in the guise of his god. He is the Romanized Thracian landowner, the retired auxiliary soldier, the master of a great villa, who pays for this plaque to celebrate his own virtues, his courage and piety. He has himself carved in the image of the divine hunter, the hero, as a way of connecting his own mortal life to the eternal sacred power of his ancestors. This explains the sheer number of them. They were the personal, spiritual identity card of a people who were losing their language but were determined to hold on to their god, a god who perfectly encapsulated their two most ancient values, the horse and the hunt. This single silent image, repeated thousands of times, became the last great and most enduring voice of the Thracian people. The quiet, personal devotion of the Thracian horseman, that small stone icon of a people holding fast to their ancestral soul, was a constant, stabilizing force, a spiritual anchor in a Roman world that was itself beginning to crack and shift under its own immense weight. The long, golden afternoon of the Pax Romana, the era of Trajan's conquests, and the settled prosperity of the 2nd century gave way to the 3rd century crisis, a 50-year period of nightmarish instability, a time of plague, economic collapse, and a terrifying succession of barracks emperors who were raised up by their legions and cut down just as quickly. The empire was tearing itself apart, and the old system, with a single distant emperor in Rome, was clearly failing. It was this crisis that forced a fundamental reimagining of the Roman world, a reimagining that would, in a single decisive move, pivot the empire's center of gravity directly back to the land of the Thracians. The first step was the Emperor Diocletian's radical reform, the Tetrarchy, a division of the empire into 4 parts, ruled by 4 men from new capitals placed much closer to the critical, threatened frontiers. This itself brought new importance to the Balkans. But it was his successor, Constantine the Great, who made the final, irrevocable change. After reuniting the empire under his sole command in 324 AD, Constantine, a man of profound revolutionary vision, understood that the old, pagan city of Rome was a relic, a symbolic and strategic dinosaur. He needed a new Rome, a Christian capital, a strategic fortress that could command the empire's most vital frontiers, the Danube to the north and the Sasanian Persian border to the east. His eyes fell upon the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium, a town perched on a small, triangular peninsula at the very easternmost tip of Thrace. It was a location of such perfect, God-given strategic genius that it seemed destined for greatness. It was a promontory of rock, easily defended, bounded on 2 sides by the Sea of Marmara to the south, and the deep, defensible inlet of the Golden Horn to the north. But its true power was its command of the Bosphorus, the Oxford, that narrow, churning strait of water that separates Europe from Asia. To hold this peninsula was to hold the key to two continents. It was the gate, the choke point, that controlled all naval traffic from the Black Sea and its vast grain resources to the Aegean and the Mediterranean. And crucially, it was a European city, firmly connected to the great military highway, the Via Militaris, which ran west through the heart of Thrace, connecting the new capital directly to the vital Danube legions. On May 11th, 330 AD, this new city was formally dedicated. It was named, inevitably, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. This single act, this grand imperial foundation, instantly and forever transformed the destiny of the land we have been following. The province of Thracia, for 3 centuries a somewhat remote, heavily recruited, and relatively quiet frontier territory, was suddenly, shockingly, no longer the edge of the world. It was the center. It became the hinterland, the suburbium, the vital European backyard of the new capital of the world. The old Thracian landscape was now the garden, the breadbasket, and the defensive wall for the vast, teeming, and perpetually hungry metropolis that was rising just across the water. This new proximity was a double-edged sword, bringing both immense prestige and a terrible newfound vulnerability. The cities of Thrace, which we saw Romanized centuries before, were elevated to a new importance. Serdica, modern-day Sofia, was a particular favorite of Constantine himself, who was said to have mused, "Serdica is my Rome." These were no longer just provincial towns. They were imperial way stations, military industrial hubs, and aristocratic suburbs, their wealth swelling as they provisioned the capital and the court. The great landowners of Thrace, the descendants of those Romanized warrior chieftains, became fabulously wealthy, their villi supplying the wheat, wine, and horses for the imperial markets. But this new, glittering importance meant that Thrace was no longer a buffer zone. It was the battleground. The Danube frontier, which the northern Dacians had once defended, was now the empire's final firewall, and Thrace was the sacred, non-negotiable territory just behind it. Any barbarian tribe that managed to cross the great river was no longer simply raiding a distant province. They were striking with terrifying speed at the capital's lifeline. And in the late 4th century, the greatest test of this new, vulnerable geography arrived in the form of the Goths. Fleeing a new, terrifying power from the steppes, the Huns, entire Gothic tribes, men, women, and children, arrived on the banks of the Danube in 376 AD, begging the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens for asylum. Valens, seeing a vast new source of recruits, agreed. He ferried them across and settled them in Thrace, but the operation was a disaster of corruption and cruelty. The local Roman commanders, in their greed, stole the Goths' supplies, letting them starve, and even, it is said, forcing them to sell their own children into slavery for scraps of dog meat. The desperate, starving, and well-armed Gothic people, pushed beyond all endurance, finally rose in a massive, violent rebellion. They were no longer refugees. They were an enemy army, loose inside the empire's most vital province. Emperor Valens, rushing from the east, gathered his imperial field army and marched into Thrace to crush them personally. On a hot, dusty, and disastrous August day in 378 AD, not far from the city of Adrianople, modern Edirne, the two armies met. Valens, overconfident and eager for glory, launched a rash, ill-coordinated attack. The Roman legions, weary from a long march, were met and then shattered by the unforeseen, thunderous charge of the Gothic heavy cavalry, a style of warfare the Romans had not prepared for. The battle was not a defeat. It was an annihilation, the single worst Roman military disaster since Hannibal. 2/3 of the Eastern army was wiped out. The elite core of the empire's military was gone, and Emperor Valens himself, wounded and unhorsed, was carried to a small farmhouse, which the Goths, not knowing he was inside, promptly set on fire. The master of the Eastern Roman Empire was burned alive by barbarians, his body never even found for burial. This was the Battle of Adrianople, a catastrophe that unfolded in the very heart of the capital's hinterland, a terrifying, fiery signal that the old world was ending, and that Thrace, the land of the horsemen, was now the front line in a new and desperate war for survival. The catastrophic Battle of Adrianople, that smoking, ash-choked field where an emperor and his army were simply erased from the earth, was more than just a military defeat. It was the end of an idea. It was the moment the limes, the sacred, inviolable border of the Danube, was proven to be a fiction, a line on a map that could no longer hold back the weight of a world on the move. The Goths, victorious and terrifying, were now inside the empire, a self-governing, armed, and restless nation wandering through the very heart of Thrace. The emperors in Constantinople, their field armies shattered, were forced into a new, desperate strategy: accommodation. They named the Goths Foederati, or Federates, officially settling them on the depopulated lands of Thrace, paying them in gold and grain in exchange for their military service. The old Thracian province, the capital's backyard, had become a barbarian garrison, a state within a state. This was the new reality. The ancient, settled world of the Romano-Thracians was now irrevocably broken, and the Goths were only the beginning. As the 5th century dawned, a new, far more terrifying power swept out of the eastern steppes, a force that made the Goths themselves seem like refugees, the Huns. Under their great and greatly feared king, Attila, the Huns did not seek to settle. They sought to bleed the empire dry. Thrace, the land bridge to Constantinople, became their personal, ravaged highway. Attila's armies stormed across the Danube time and time again, brushing aside the weakened Roman garrisons. They did not just raid, they obliterated. The grand Roman cities we have spoken of, Serdica, Philippopolis, Augusta Traiana, were sacked, burned, and their populations massacred or scattered to the winds. The countryside was left a smoking, depopulated wasteland, the old villa estates abandoned, the fields untilled. When Attila's empire collapsed after his death in 453 AD, his Hunnic storm vanished as quickly as it had arrived. But the damage was permanent. Thrace was a vacuum, a hollowed-out land of ruined cities and fallow fields, its native Romano-Thracian population decimated, scattered, or huddled in the most remote mountain valleys, the old, high strongholds of their ancestors. And it is into this vacuum, this profound demographic emptiness, that the final and most transformative migration began. It was not a thunderous charge of horsemen, nor the march of a single Gothic army. It was instead a slow, quiet, and unstoppable tide of people filtering south across the Danube, year after year, decade after decade. These were the Slavs. They came in small clans and family groups, an agricultural people from the forests and marshes north of the Carpathians, seeking new, empty land to plow. They found it in Thrace. The Eastern Roman Empire, now what we call the Byzantine Empire, was simply too weak, too exhausted by its epic existential wars with the Sasanian Persians in the east to guard the 1,000-mile Danube frontier. The Slavs simply walked in. They settled in the deep river valleys, in the fertile plains, in the foothills of the Haemus and Rhodope, the very heartland that had once nurtured the Odrysians and the Bessi. They brought their own language, a new Slavic tongue. They brought their own gods, a pantheon of forest and sky, of Perun the Thunderer and Vales the god of the earth. And they, unlike the Goths or Huns, were there to stay. This is the moment of the great silent assimilation, the final closing of our story. What, in this new world, became of the Thracians? The Romans had conquered their kings, but it was the Slavs who inherited their people. The Thracians, or rather, the by now heavily Romanized and Latin-speaking Romano-Thracians, were not for the most part systematically exterminated. They were, quite simply, outnumbered and absorbed. They were a rural, leaderless populace, their cities in ruins, their aristocracy long since fled or integrated. The unwritten Thracian language, which had already been fading for 600 years under the dominance of Latin and Greek, stood no chance against the new, vigorous, and dominant Slavic tongue of the marketplace, the fields, and the new, powerful tribal confederations. The Romano-Thracians learned the Slavic language to speak to their new neighbors. Their children and their children's children thus intermarried. The old, half-forgotten gods, the last vestiges of the Thracian horsemen, were subsumed first by Roman Christianity and then by the Slavic paganism that was itself, in time, replaced by the Orthodox Christianity of the new Bulgarian kingdom. In the 7th century, a new, final layer was added. The Bulgars, a Turkic warrior aristocracy, swept in from the steppe, conquered the Slavic tribes, and forged the First Bulgarian Empire. But the Bulgars were a small ruling caste, and in a final ironic act of assimilation, they too were absorbed, adopting the Slavic language of the vast majority they now ruled. This new, powerful, Slavic-speaking, and eventually Christian Bulgarian state became the permanent master of the old Thracian lands. The Thracian identity as a distinct people was gone, evaporated into this new synthesis. The language was silent, leaving behind only the mysterious names of its mountains and its rivers, a riddle for linguists. The Thracians, a people who, as Herodotus noted, would be the most powerful of all nations, were they only united, had found their final unforeseen unity, their bloodline continuing, but their name and their voice lost, fused into the new peoples of the Balkans. They are the silent, golden, and horse-loving ancestors of a land that still bears their name, a story told not in words, but in the painted gaze of the couple at Kazanlak, and in the thousands of silent mounds of earth that still keep their long final watch over the valleys, a quiet, sleeping testament to a world now entirely vanished into the soil.